Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Savior King, the Master Tactician and the Queen of Liberation in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 31. Thank you for carrying me up here, Prince Vlad did. The peasant girl smiled sweetly at him from where she was lying in bed, propped up on pillows. Manuela was taking her temperature, murmuring uneasily to herself as she double-checked the notepad on the table. I was getting kind of dizzy. It was no trouble at all, Dmitri reassured her. His heart clenched as he examined her. She was so small, so young. The road to Garagmach was a lot safer than many had become over the past decades, but to travel all the way here from Remire, alone, how frightened were the residents of that fateful village he'd visited all those months ago. What was going on? How are you feeling now? Better, she said, bobbling her head. My head still hurts, but I think what Atra gave me has started working now. She said it might take a while cause I'd drank so much from the well, then she frowned. Micah kept saying he was fine, but I know that he had a lot too. I hope the guy in the cloak sits on him until he finishes the pie too. I hope so too, Dmitri said kindly and entirely honestly. It was lucky that he'd decided to take his impromptu archery practice to the fields just outside the monastery walls so as not to interfere with the Black Eagle intensive training, otherwise he wouldn't have been there to catch the swaying, exhausted village girl who stumbled alone down the road. The only coherent words he'd managed to get out of her at the time were Geralt and bye, otherwise she simply wasn't clear-headed. He'd rushed her to the medical wing and went to collect Manuela's hangover cure when it became clear that the latter was still shaking off the remainder of her latest drinking binge. Thankfully, having a young patient suddenly presented to her helped her sober up quickly. That was yesterday. Dmitri had felt compelled to visit, since Captain Geralt and the mercenaries were on their way back from some minor business Lady Ria had asked them to attend to. Fortunately, the young girl, Miria, had recovered quite well in the intervening time, Manuela having worked through the night examining her odd symptoms and having ingested some sort of counteragent likely contributed to that, and was proving rather talkative. She fed you a pie? Manuela asked, grabbing a quill. Her eyebrows shot up with incredulity. Can you tell me about it? Miria wrinkled her nose. It wasn't really a proper pie, she put the medicine inside so it wouldn't taste so awful and be easier to swallow. It was weird and kinda gross and it felt funny going down my throat, like trying to eat moonbeams and dirt. But it made my head hurt less, and my blood didn't feel so hot afterwards. Were a lot of people in Remire complaining about feeling headachy and hot? Manuela asked with a lightness that didn't match up with her worried expression. Yup, Miria nodded solemnly. Atra said that something nasty had been dumped in the well a while ago, and everyone drinks from the well. It's how we get our water and take care of the gardens when the rains are hiding. She let out a massive yawn. I hated being so hot, I couldn't sleep, and I was just so cranky. Micah was worse, yelling at everyone all the time for no reason. Everyone drinks from the well. Manuela repeated. Miria made a face. The woman sighed and did her best to look contrite. I'm very sorry, dear, just a few more questions and I'll let you get some more sleep, okay? Dmitri patted her hand encouragingly. She gave him a beaming smile. She was so happy to have a prince paying attention to her, and nodded, albeit a bit reluctantly. Yup, everyone's gotta use the well. We don't got running water like you fancy folk. Was anyone other than Micah acting oddly aggressive? When the village girl looked blankly at her, Manuela amended, was anyone else acting in anger? Miria's face scrunched up with thought. I think I heard Mum talking about Mr. Garland, and how he was agitated, saying we were being watched and there were enemies in the woods or something, but I don't know about that. Mum kept me inside, told me to sleep it off. But I couldn't sleep, I told her. I was too hot and my head hurt so much. Everything was too hot. Unease curled inside Dmitri's stomach like a vicious snake. It could just be a fever, he told himself, careful not to let that feeling show. Can you describe Atra to me? You said that she gave you a cure. Miria frowned and shook her head. She didn't say it was a cure, but a counteragent. She said the last words slowly, feeling out unfamiliar words and syllables. That it would cancel out the effects for now, but if we didn't stop drinking from the well it wouldn't be enough. That we needed to go get more help. The little girl frowned. She looked really worried, and angry. I've never seen anyone look so angry. She knows what's going on, his father said darkly. She's about as tall as Prince Vlad did, Miria went on. Except I don't think she's from the kingdom, her accent is really funny. Never heard anything like it. She's got all these burns on her, Mum says a lot of them look like sun poisoning, but the rest are from fire. Her hair's black and really long, she ties it back like this. She pulled her brown hair aside and demonstrated a low ponytail. And she has really dark blue eyes. She's got these two swords she uses, and one of them is this super neat blade that catches fire when she draws it. It's magical, she said. She looked thoughtful for a moment, then snapped her fingers. Oh. And there's this other guy who's with her, he's super mysterious, just like her. He doesn't talk a lot, and his voice is really low and raspy. Like something scratched up his throat, something awful. He wears this dark blue coat with a hood over his head, and he's got a sword too. I don't really remember his face or his hair or anything. He's kind of creepy, she shook her head. But he was really nice to me. He's the one who suggested putting the medicine in a pie when I couldn't eat it the first time. She frowned. I don't think I ever heard his name though. He doesn't really talk, maybe talking hurts a bit because his throat's all scratchy. That's certainly possible, Manuela said, scribbling furiously as she copied down notes. Thank you, Miria. This will be very helpful to us. Will you tell Cap Geralt and bye? The girl asked insistently even as Dmitri helped her settle into a comfortable sleeping position and adjust the heavy blankets over her. Of course, he promised her. I'll let them know as soon as they get back that you're here. Her eyes were still a little glassy looking. Thank you, Miria nuzzled the pillow and blankets, her shoulders relaxing as she started to drift off to sleep. Dmitri stood up, careful not to jostle the chair he'd been sitting in and make unnecessary noise. He gave Manuela a worried look. She gestured to the doorway while placing the back of her hand on the peasant girl's forehead, taking her temperature one last time, just to be sure. With one backward look, his mind buzzing with dark thoughts, the prince made his way out of the room. Waiting outside the door was Sir Shamir. She looked severe as ever, with only a glint in her eye suggesting she was worried. How is she? The taciturn knight asked him. Professor Manuela thinks that she'll recover. Apparently there's someone in the village now who knows what's happening, Dmitri responded. He felt cold. Though what she has said is a little concerning. How so? These mysterious figures told her that their well water has been contaminated, and the way she phrased that, it may have been deliberate tampering rather than a natural accident. Manuela said, gently closing the door behind her. Her initial symptoms were close to a normal fever, but the esoteric symptoms she complained about are very strange and quite concerning. What exactly are we dealing with? Shamir asked, crossing her arms. It's hard to tell. Manuela sighed. I would have to visit Remire and do a more in-depth examination of other sick townsfolk to get enough data to make a prognosis. It's true that the village isn't far away, a 2 days' march at the slowest, but the Black Eagles still require my tutelage, and even if I brought them along they wouldn't be able to train or learn lessons while I worked. Could Seath perhaps substitute for you? Dmitri offered hesitantly. I would have to ask him, he has his own duties, after all. He's not particularly busy this month, however, so perhaps your idea has merit. Whatever would we do without you, Prince Dmitri? The professor winked at him. Dmitri felt a little awkward under the gesture even as he nodded in appreciation. I'll report your findings to the Archbishop. The rumors out of Remire have been spreading, she wants to be kept up to date. Shamir said simply. Your Highness, we'll handle things from here. Thanks for your help. Dmitri bowed and made himself scarce, hearing Shamir and Manuela speaking to each other in low, worried tones up until he began climbing the stairs down to the first floor. Remire. There was a name that brought back memories. Dmitri hadn't thought too hard on the small village that had been his salvation that fateful night outside of the stories he occasionally overheard from Geralt's mercenaries, but from what he remembered it was a very ordinary and peaceful place. A welcoming one. What could possibly bring trouble to such an innocent place? Especially through such crude methods as tampering with their water. for Miria's mother to send her alone to the monastery to ask for help, in spite of the fact that she was sick, she must be quite afraid. What is going on over there? Byleth and Sir Gerald will certainly want to know about this. I hope they return soon. Byleth and Claude are running late by a few days. I hope they're all right. You worry too damned much, Glenn said in amusement. How many times have you seen them in a fight by now? You sound like a fable princess. Please let it go. Dimitri pleaded, feeling a little familiar warmth in his face. It's no sin to worry. Glenn did have something of a point, at least, he knew perfectly well that the deer and the wolves were a strikingly competent bunch. He really shouldn't let himself get worked up until they were a week, 2 weeks behind without a word or a message to explain the delay. Then he would worry, go after them, and give them an Ingrid-style lecture when he found them. Between Ingrid and I, they'd never go missing again, he thought with a small streak of amusement. It lifted his spirits a bit. His feet hit the last step with a clack that drew him out of his thoughts. Stepping out of the stairwell, Dimitri pondered what to do with his free afternoon for a long minute before deciding to go back to his archery practice. The Battle of the Eagle and Lion had made it plainly clear that he should invest in some way of driving off enemies that could attack from a distance, otherwise he could end up riddled with spears and arrows before he got close to his target. Claude had been both amused and delighted when he humbly repeated his request from the victory feast, about learning how to shoot a warbow, so it sank in all the way. I wouldn't have thought that Claude was an affectionate drunk, somehow I anticipated that lowering his defenses would make him sour and bad-tempered, given how often he wears an artificial smile. Dimitri closed his eyes for a moment as he started making his way toward the barracks. Either way, he's a terrible tease. Even knowing that his friend had been partially drunk in that moment didn't disperse the warm bubbly feeling the memory gave him, nor the sense of sad helplessness that always followed directly on its heels. Even when you're away, you haunt my thoughts. What am I going to do about you, Claude? His sense of duty, of honor, was telling him to put these feelings aside for both their sakes. His heart was childishly raging at the unfairness of it all. They were in a constant struggle that ate away at his peace of mind, making him crave distraction. He'd yet to find a chance to discuss, however indirectly, this struggle with Byleth. She was the only person he could imagine trying to speak to, knowing that she wouldn't judge him, and her counsel always gave him hope. The fanciful hope of luring her away to Fairgus lingered in the back of his mind, which he felt a little guilty for whenever he dwelled on it. Claude was so often legitimately happy in her presence, to abscond with her would be a little cruel, wouldn't it? I need your help, Byleth. What should I do? How do you bury your feelings as deeply as you do to keep them from conflicting with your mission? The sun and the clear sky didn't give him an answer, though their warmth was a little comforting, nonetheless. Upon reclaiming the training bow he'd been using yesterday, Dimitri left Felix and Caspar, as well as Ferdinand and Monica, it should be said, to their sparring in favor of heading out to the open fields in front of the monastery. He had a rudimentary knowledge of and ability with the bow, having been hunting plenty of times, but there was a difference between hunting game and sniping enemies on the field. He needed to play some catch-up before he was as capable as Ash or even Felix, who had some archery training that he'd quiet after Glenn. Well, Dimitri would improve. Claude's basic instructions were still fresh on his mind despite being a number of days old. Oh, Your Highness, I mean, Dimitri. He probably shouldn't have been too surprised to find Ash in the impromptu shooting range that had been set up for them, but he could have sworn the other boy had decided to take the day off. I hope I'm not intruding here, I just decided dash. It's no worry my friend, really. Dimitri smiled at the gray-haired boy, who'd clearly been here for a while judging by the number of arrows lodged into various targets. Would you be willing to give me some advice while we train? I bow to your superior ability in this area. Ash blushed a bit. Give you advice? Sure, I guess. I mean, I'm still learning myself, but, he ran a hand through his hair. I didn't know you used a bow, Dimitri. I don't, not really. I've been hunting, but I've never used it in combat before. Dimitri's lip twitched upwards. Which, as Claude has proven to me, is a bit of a problem, and that's putting aside the mages that have troubled me ever since my first deployment. Shall we begin? Ash smiled in understanding and bobbled his head. All right, if you're sure. I'll do my best. You ought to be more confident in yourself, Dmitri thought in mingled amusement and faint exasperation as Ash began to give him some familiar-sounding advice. You've improved in leaps and bounds since Magdrid. Claude agrees with me. He was improving virtually neck and neck with Bernadetta, both with his bow and the secondary weapon Byleth had encouraged him to pick up, the lance. Apparently the two were sharing riding classes. Dmitri had little doubt of what sort of combat class the two of them were aiming for. Archer knights were infamous for their dominance over the battlefield, which was only matched by wyvern riders and mages with siege magic. Falcon knights came close, but they were a bit more fragile than their scaly counterparts and preferred to take out enemy ballistics or magic users. You didn't have to press any veteran knight very hard before they started ranting about how the one time they barely escaped with their lives when a mounted archer rushed them, shot down most of their battalion comrades, and escaped back to their own ranks all in a single charge. The fighting style took a long time and intense training to master, especially since you had to take both hands off the reins to fight effectively, but those who succeeded were both revered and feared. And Ash is on his way, Dmitri thought even as he listened with care. Lonato would be proud to see how much he's improved. His own horseback training was progressing smoothly, he had plenty of practice, and it was more a case of him remembering things he'd left to linger than learning. He doubted he'd ever be proficient at horseback archery, however, he would stick with his lance, and use his bow whenever circumstances demanded he fight on foot. Ash was rather uncertain about teaching, but watching him was at least as informative as any lecture or written exam on archery. He told Dmitri to move while shooting at the targets, giving him a better idea of how the speed of combat would affect aiming. The prince's initial efforts while taking this advice were rather embarrassing, to be honest, but it showed what he needed to improve. I marvel at how easy Byleth, Claude, and Bernadetta make this look, Dmitri thought ruefully. Practice was long and a little grueling. The bow put pressure on different parts of his arm and shoulder than he was used to when wielding a sword or lance, and after a little while he was quite grateful to be wearing gloves. His fingers were sore, his thumb most of all, his lower back also hurt a bit. If Ash was at all discomforted, he either wasn't showing it or was used to it. Dmitri was pleased, though. There were about as many arrows lodged in the various targets as there were littering the grass, a sign of progress. Of course Ash was outshooting him easily, but that was to be expected. Ash still blushed under any praise from him, he did smile and look a little proud, however. Dmitri considered that a small victory. The sun had passed the highest point in the sky when the whinnying of horses distracted the two lions from their practice. Both curious and hopeful, Dmitri slung his bow back over his shoulder and hurried forward until he was at the edge of the hill overlooking the plains below, Ash directly on his heels. Approaching the monastery on the roads below was the long trail of a merchant caravan and a number of distantly familiar figures. "That's the professor," Ash said in relief. "They've finally made it back." Dmitri let out a soft sigh, feeling a tightness in his chest finally ease. "Shall we go down and welcome them back? It looks like they've been escorting those merchants." Even from this angle, Dmitri could see the deer had taken a defensive formation on both sides of the two caravans that had joined them on their return journey. "They may need some help." Ash didn't respond instantly, his eyes were flickering around the group as if he was trying to find someone in particular. He jumped and looked a little embarrassed when Dmitri tapped his shoulder. "All right, let's go." Dmitri made his way down the hill and to the road. As he drew closer to the group, he waved, a gesture that earned surprised cheers from Raphael and Balthus. Byleth, who was up front, smiled brilliantly and picked up her pace, running until she was a few feet away from him. "Hello Dmitri," she said with the low-key yet warm happiness characteristic of her. "You haven't been waiting out here for us for very long, have you?" "I was practicing with Ash, though to be honest I have been a little worried." "It's not like you to return so late, Professor." Dmitri gave her a critical once-over, noticing with concern that her clothes were rather dirty, as were her hands and hair. All in all, she looked somewhat harried, and a quick look over her shoulder to the approaching caravan showed that she wasn't the only one. "What happened?" Byleth sighed, a slightly dark look crossing her face. "I'm sorry, I should have sent a letter ahead. We ran into some trouble before we left Alliance territory." She glanced back, her eyes momentarily seeking out Raphael. "And by trouble, I mean, we ended up stumbling on Lord Gloucester's scheme to control trade to Deirdre. Those merchants you see behind us were part of a caravan that we found being set upon by demonic beasts and soldiers answering to Lawrence's father. Dimitri scowled. Lord Gloucester set up Alliance citizens to be ambushed. A wave of revulsion washed over him at Byleth's tight nod. Did Lawrence know about this? No. He was just as shocked as Ignatz. Byleth grimaced. Apparently Ignatz's brother had been complaining to him for a while about how seemingly meaningless blockades were forcing him and other merchant guilds onto more and more dangerous routes. More and more monsters have been slipping out of the forest of beasts despite Margrave Edmund's best efforts, and Lord Gloucester had been slow to respond to security concerns. Clearly he had his own reasons for that, though. The prince felt his nails dig painfully into his palm. That's barbaric. He spat, catching onto the implications easily. Can you not prove this? Theoretically, yes. In practice? It would take a long time and the support of some other lords, and that's assuming we could make charges of tyranny stick. Byleth's eyes darkened further. And if the rumor that Lord Gloucester previously used this same scheme to kill Godfrey Regan and Raphael's parents and got away with it, I don't like our chances. Godfrey Regan? Wait, Raphael's parents. I can't believe it. Everyone knows he did it, but they won't prosecute him. Ash blurted out, eyes wide as dinner plates. Oh really? Dimitri gritted his teeth and didn't say anything. Wasn't the entire point of seceding from Faerghus to prevent blue-blooded souls from doing as they please with the people below them without consequences? All everyone knows is a rumor. Byleth crossed her arms. Unfortunately Lord Gloucester covered his tracks well back then. She did smile a bit now. It was a distinctly predatory look. He wasn't so lucky this time, however. I imagine Lord Regan is going to rake him over coals at the next conference thanks to Claude's letter, and the merchants came with us so they could complain to the Knights of Sirios as well. I suppose that's better than nothing, Dimitri sighed. Then he frowned, eyeing the approaching crowd again. Where is Claude, by the way? Is he hurt? Resting in one of the wagons, Byleth said reassuringly. He and I loaned our horse to one of the merchants who was hurt in the fight. Everyone's more or less in one piece, just tired and a bit overworked. It was one bad fight more than we were expecting, after all. It was around this time that the rest of the deer and the merchants caught up with them. Marianne. Ash said in relief when he spotted the blue-haired girl. Lysithea. It's good to see you. Annette and I were starting to worry. He trotted over in their direction as Yuri hopped off the back of the first wagon, Claude directly on his heels. Didn't keep you waiting too long, did we? The brunette asked innocently. He, like Byleth, looked rather dirty and scuffed up but otherwise in good cheer. You're late, Dimitri responded dryly, determined not to smile and give away the weight of the relief warming his chest. Does it amuse you to make people worry? You don't think I'm that much of a jerk, do you? Claude complained. Again his casual words were at odds with the bright spark in his emerald eyes. That spark grew a bit brighter as his eyes focused on the bow on his shoulder. I see Ash took over instruction while I was out. Yuri's eyes moved between the two of them and his eyebrows raised marginally at the banter. That reminds me, I really should throw you at him as well, Yuri. Byleth said obliviously just as a sly smile started to cross the violet-eyed teen's face. You can only really use 2 spells, and you mentioned before that you were interested in archery. Need to change my schedule again. Balthus laughed loudly as Yuri's expression became slightly chagrined. You do realize that some of us have hobbies outside of training, right, Professor? He asked. Byleth turned back and gave him an innocent look. If you've got the time to disappear off into town for menial reasons multiple times a week, you have time to train with a bow, she chided him. Claude visibly suppressed a snicker while Yuri looked skyward in exasperation. Of course, I need to report in first, and everyone should take the rest of the day off. You've all more than earned it. This did earn a number of cheers. Dimitri offered his assistance and quickly found himself being handed a number of gifts the merchants had set aside for the deer and wolves in thanks for their rescue mission. They took the form of somewhat exotic weapons, medical concoctions, and gold, a not insignificant amount of gold, at that. While all the merchants were healthy and hale thanks to Marianne, they were still rather rattled and nervous, which Dimitri didn't blame them for in the slightest. Knowing their local lord was responsible for their attempted murders must be hard to face. He and the deer lead them into the front town, where surprisingly enough Shamir was having a conversation with Catherine. Byleth directed the merchants over to them, urging them to speak plainly about what happened, before clapping and urging her students to bathe and get some rest. It was seeing Shamir, however, that reminded Dmitri of what had happened this morning, and he lightly touched Byleth's shoulder before she, Claude and Yuri could disperse. "Professor, there's something you should know," he said. She frowned at him. "What's happened?" "Miria from Remire arrived at the monastery yesterday, alone. She was quite sick, and she was asking for you and Captain Geralt." Byleth's eyes widened immediately. "Miria!" she blurted out, sharp alarm in her usually serene voice. Claude's expression flattened in surprise while Yuri looked puzzled. "Is she all right?" "Where is she?" "She's stable, and sleeping as far as I know. Manuela is looking after her in the hospital wing." Dmitri looked around the crowded market and sighed. "Let's move over to the pier, something disturbing is going on." Visibly worried, despite how increasingly expressive she had become, it was still startling to see Byleth react so strongly to something. She'd even had a fairly matter-of-fact attitude to revealing that Suthies was living within her. She immediately took the lead, hurrying out of the marketplace toward the comparatively quieter docks. Claude and Yuri exchanged a look before following along as well. Dmitri didn't mind. Hopefully they could lend some insight. Once they reached the docks, Dmitri sat next to Byleth on the pier and quickly explained everything that had happened since Miria stumbled across him in the fields, her symptoms, the odd and worrying stories coming out of Remire, and the mysterious figure attached to it. The professor's expression quickly became stormy and unreadable, her fingers digging into her knees as she listened. "Wait, hang on a sec." Claude frowned, his brow furrowed. "Long black hair, lots of burns, weird accent. Isn't that the Atra that we met down in Abyss?" "Huh." Dmitri blinked. He didn't remember that. "That sounds just like her," Yuri said slightly uneasily. "She mentioned that her companion was visiting Remire back when we were dealing with the chalice. How long has this been festering?" "I think I remember her." Byleth frowned at Yuri. "Though I thought she was one of your people." Yuri made a so-so gesture with his hands. "Sort of. I met her roughly 2 years ago. She'd been seriously hurt in some sort of fight, crawled down into the tunnels to hide from her pursuers. She hadn't known anyone else was down there, and it took quite a bit of convincing to get her to believe that no one would rat her out. She keeps all the rules and often helps bring people here to hide, but half the time she vanishes off to do her own thing, and I see her friend even less than her." "Who is she?" Byleth asked tightly. Yuri blew out a breath, frowning. "No one knows. Atra does not talk about her past. That's hardly a rarity in Abyss. Most people are running from things they're trying to forget about. But half of what intrigues me about Atra is that I can't really intuit who she might have been before. Between the books she finds, some of the stuff she says, the few times she lets herself get tipsy, well, my current working theory was that she was from an obscure family right on the Alliance border who got expelled from the Eastern Church for high heresy. And I'm not willing to bet too much on that." "Do you think she's trustworthy?" "Miria said that she's been giving the villagers counter-agents to whatever's affecting them." Dmitri asked. Yuri snorted. "You're asking the wrong guy about trust. That's a pretty new concept to me." Claude closed his eyes for a split second at that remark. "Do I think Atra is a dangerous woman?" "You're damn right I do." "Do I think she's a danger to your average peasant?" "Not hardly. Saying or even implying something that devalues someone else's life is near guaranteed to get you one of her swords through the eye and right out the back of your head." He shrugged uneasily. "Her companion, I can't really say anything about. He doesn't talk much, but Atra trusts him, so I think it's safe to assume they have similar values." "Nothing at all?" Claude sounded surprised. "He seems to be a quiet guy, and I've only met him a handful of times compared to Atra." Yuri looked contemplative. "He'd a wickedly capable sword master, though unlike her he sticks to just one sword. One thing I have noticed is that he seems to unknowingly swing between perfect Faergus combat styles and less smooth self-taught movements. I suspect he got seriously injured at some point and had to reteach himself on the fly." Byleth seemed to slump a bit at this. At least that's good news, she whispered. Dmitri hesitated a moment, then gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Professor, he prompted. Byleth closed her eyes. I owe the people of Remire, she said quietly. That village is the closest thing I've ever had to a home before I came here. They were the first people who truly welcomed me. When Father brought me there, sick with fever and wounded from battle, they took us in and cared for me without hesitation. No one there was ever afraid of me. I can't let anything bad happen to them. She raised a hand and pulled at a loose lock of her hair, agitation in her eyes. Then we'll make sure they stay safe, Claude piped up seriously. Troubling rumors, a weird sickness flaring up, that's enough to warrant an investigation from the church, isn't it? Wouldn't want to risk it turning to a plague, even if you dismiss foul play as a possibility. Father has the authority to order one, Byleth noted, scrubbing her face tiredly. I just have to wait until he comes back. And see Miria myself. Erin, her mother, has cooked for us many times in the past. In hindsight, it's too bad we couldn't stay a day back then and be treated to their hospitality. She's really good at it. She bit her lip. I hope Micah hasn't gotten too sick. They're twins, and quite close despite what they might tell you. I can't believe Erin didn't send them together. I can't believe she sent Miria alone. What is going on back there? Nothing good, Glenn said unhelpfully. Dmitri very carefully avoided reacting to the sudden intrusion, but he wasn't sure he succeeded, because Claude gave him an odd look. She'll be happy to see you when she wakes up, he said instead, doing his best to give her a reassuring smile when she turned toward him. She was asking after you. Byleth's expression softened just a bit. It's almost cruel how beautiful you are when you look happy. She's a sweet girl, she said quietly. I'm glad she's recovering. I'll go and see her once I've had a bath and look slightly less bedraggled. Dmitri, might I have a moment of your time? Dmitri blinked, one hand still resting on the pew he'd just started to leave. Ah, yes, Seath, certainly. Is something the matter? The green-haired bishop eyed him for a minute before saying, not necessarily, there's merely something I wished to ask you. Nodding in slight confusion, Dmitri gestured for Ingrid and Mercedes to go on without him and followed Seath back to his office on the second floor. While on the way up, he spotted Byleth heading to the hospital wing and caught her eye. She smiled and gave him a small wave before continuing on her way. Just that little gesture made him feel slightly giddy. Just as nice was Seath's reaction, a warm greeting, a quick inquiry into Miria's health and informing the professor that she was welcome to eat lunch with the village girl if she thought that would help her mood. It seemed whatever concerns the bishop had over Byleth's loyalties had been thoroughly buried by her rescue of Flane. Now the older man treated her with the same friendly concern he expressed for all other students. Sit, please, Seath said lightly, gesturing to the chair facing his desk. Dmitri nodded, glancing at an open book on the wooden desktop as he did so. It looked like a children's book, judging by the larger-than-usual letters and simple sentences. I wonder why he'd have one of those here? Has something happened in Fairgus? Dmitri asked, concern niggling at the back of his mind. Have you been sent notice to recall me? No, nothing that severe. It's a matter concerning you and your health, however. Seath said severely as he sat down across from him. I'm not sure I understand, Dmitri said, blinking. Seath sighed and pointedly asked, Dmitri, when was the last time you slept through the night without interruption of any sort? That's Dmitri hesitated, his knee-jerk reaction was to deny it. The last few days have been fairly peaceful, why? Because according to the servants, you seem to spend more of your nights awake than not, Seath responded, a chiding note in his voice. Dmitri rather felt like he was 10 years old, being scolded by Rodrigue for trying to ride one of the more fiery stallions without permission. You're going to make yourself quite ill if this continues, not to mention how it will weaken your body. Why have you not asked Professor Manuela for medicine? There are aids for such difficulties here. I didn't want to be a bother, Dmitri responded evasively. I do try and rest when possible whenever my nights are difficult. It's not truly Dmitri, Seath interrupted sternly. Attempting to care for your health does not make you a bother. As a matter of fact, it is part of our responsibilities while you are here. If you continue to lose sleep as you have the past month or so, I strongly encourage you to seek Professor Manuela out.
Yes, sir.
Dmitri said, abashed. I don't want to be a burden. I don't want to be a constant source of concern for others. I have to be able to fight and function even when I'm weak, sick, flagging. Or else I'll just be dead weight, just like I was back then. Sita's frown deepened a bit at whatever he saw in Dmitri's eyes then. Has something been troubling you since you arrived here?
No, I just have a lot on my mind.
You have enough trouble to sort through with the continued conflict with the Western Church without bearing my burdens as well. There are many things to attend to, even putting my studies aside. I sincerely hope you aren't overworking yourself due to misplaced feelings born from that incident. Dmitri shook his head even as his heart was clenched in a vice. No. I will get stronger yet, but I'm mindful of my limits.
Liar, Glenn snorted.
The prince bit his lip and didn't reply.
Well, I'm glad to hear that at least.
Sita said, clasping his hands together.
Go and speak to Manuela before you sleep tonight.
The better rested you are, the easier it will be to learn.
Very well.
Thank you for your concern for me. Dmitri bowed politely. It was genuinely a surprise to realize that the taciturn man had been keeping a concerned eye on him, and that the maids he occasionally ran into when wandering the halls at night were also worried about him. It wasn't a bad feeling, it was just surprising. It's no trouble. It is my duty as an overseer of the academy.
I don't think he believes you,
his father noted mildly as Dmitri was dismissed and left Sita's office.
You're a poor liar, my son.
I'll leave that to Claude and Yuri, Dmitri thought back darkly, his mind briefly drifting to Lord Gloucester.
I'm not an alliance lord.
Glenn chuckled. Yeah, you'd be dead in a few days. He could feel his friend's eyes boring into him. You're not going to let this distract you from your search, right? You aren't going to stop.
Of course not.
Dmitri glanced down the hallway toward the hospital wing. After hesitating for a moment, he retraced his footsteps there until he was standing by the open doorway. Inside, Byleth was sitting next to Miria's bed. The little girl was gesturing animatedly, anxiety and concern radiating off of her voice as she babbled about how strangely everyone had been acting recently. Byleth mostly let her talk, only making her pause to ask the occasional question, all while brushing her small friend's hair. The scene was so innocent and sweet that he loathed to intrude on them. It'll be all right. As soon as father gets back, we should be able to come and investigate. Byleth promised. You'll see Micah soon, I promise. Miria didn't respond vocally. Byleth put the hairbrush down and gently put both her arms around the girl's shoulders, tugging her back against her chest. Miria let out a small whine and leaned into her, the stress of having to flee her home and go alone to get help having clearly sunk in by now. She was clinging to the familiar powerful figure of her older protector. Byleth. Byleth stroked her hair. Dmitri smiled softly at the sight. He wondered if she ever entertained the notion of being a mother. It didn't seem like something she would have given much thought to, but if she had, would she? She slid into the role so easily. Could he ask her about it at some point? It would be terribly forward of him, but... Dmitri felt himself blush and quickly pulled himself away, leaning against the wall. I'm a mess, he thought, shaky internal laugh. She's too good for a man like me. She deserves someone whole, not a boor struggling with his bloodlust. Claude would make a better match for her than me. Gerald returned with little fanfare that evening. He'd quickly come to visit Miria as well, along with Hannah, Falry, and Gustav of the mercenaries, easily the three that Dmitri recognized the fastest. The little girl recognized all of them and was so relieved she cried. My child and I owe a great debt to Remire, Gerald had reiterated to Lady Rhea and Seath after Miria cried herself to sleep. If something's going on there, I have to find out what and put a stop to it. Fair enough, Seath shook his head. There are rumors about peasants and travelers on the road behaving strangely aggressive for the past several weeks. If Remire is the source of them, it's best that it is located and stamped out. Take our professor and her class along with you, along with anyone who volunteers. Rhea urged him, her eyes gentle and serene as ever despite the worry in her voice. If we cannot protect those who look to us for hope and protection, then what does the church exist for? Dmitri hadn't given it much thought himself before going to his class and suggesting the notion of volunteering. In a way, he owed Riemeyer as well. It was because of them that he met Byleth and Geralt and they saved his life. And that was before he considered the fact that they were peasants, defenseless and powerless, at the mercy of a phantom evil, just like many of his own people, who still had to lock their gates in fear of bandits and deserters from the army. Thankfully, he didn't need to argue for very long. Didu and Mercedes agreed without question, which was what he expected. Felix was a little more sanguine about the whole matter, noting that if it was just an illness there wasn't much he'd be able to do to help. However, he eventually agreed, after Annette and Ash threw their lot into going. It's true that it could be nothing, Ash had said with an edge of urgency. But what if it is something? I think the more of us go, the better. I mean, we lose nothing if it's just a contaminated well, it's just a 2-day trip. He's right. Besides, it's not like we can't help with illnesses. I've learned to heal from Mercy, and there are other tricks Mother taught me to fight off potential plague spread, Annette agreed quickly. So it was a sizable force that left Garregmach the next day to travel to Riemeyer, the Blue Lions, the Golden Deer, and the whole of Geralt's mercenaries. When the latter had often been split up to handle different missions while acting in concert with the Knights of Sirios, it made for quite the scene to see them all together. Admittedly, the effect was a little undermined by how visibly tense both Byleth and Geralt himself were. While Byleth wasn't highly talkative on most occasions, now she was completely silent, only answering questions asked to her, and even then her answers were brief and to the point. Geralt mirrored this stony silence despite Aloise's best efforts. He only broke it to bark orders or think aloud on the situation. Dmitri, having warmed up to the pair's odd deadpan humor and frequent gruff fussing, found the silence suffocating. Claude clearly didn't like it either. Nor the fact that he couldn't really seem to distract Byleth from the dark direction of her thoughts despite his efforts, which usually worked to boot. You've seen her like this once before. His father murmured. Remember? Dmitri bit his lip hard. Yes. While we were running from the Chalice's defenses, he could see flashes of her expressions while running, while fighting for her life, fighting for their lives, his life. Stone-faced. Determined. Scared. The only difference here was that she was a calmer and composed, and not running herself ragged. I think I see where it might have come from. Gargoyle. His father regarded her thoughtfully. If she went into all her fights with that cold, expressionless face. Dmitri shook his head. Perhaps you two have more in common than you believe. You're wrong. Dmitri. Annette's voice cut into his thoughts. You look like you're miles away. Ah, sorry, Dmitri managed not to wince, but it took some effort. It had been a while since he'd slipped up like that in public, sunk into the halfway point between this life and the next without realizing it. With a start he realized that this hadn't happened in a while. In fact, the last significant time it had happened was back in the abyss over a month ago. How had that happened? I was thinking so loudly, I couldn't hear you. He could feel Felix scowling at his back. He wondered how his old friend always seemed to be aware when he was slipping. It was a few hours later that they first saw the smoke curling up beyond the trees. The first thing Dmitri heard was the screaming. It hit his ears like a physical blow. Staggered him. His completely numb fingers jabbed into his palm as he picked up the pace, being a few feet behind Byleth as she rushed ahead, ignoring Aloise's worried shouts and various calls from their fellow students. The screaming grew louder the closer they ran, the smell of smoke filled his nose, and the cries they heard were mingled with the crackle-snap of multiple raging fires. Byleth darted through a familiar set of trees and entered a very familiar field. He and Claude had run through here to reach Riemeyer back then, hadn't they? Before coming to a harsh stop. Somehow, even over the roaring in his ears and the pounding in his ears, Dmitri heard the strangled gasp that escaped her throat when he came up next to her, staring out at what she was seeing. Riemeyer was on fire. From their vantage point, he could see multiple large blazes across the fields and houses that made up people's homes. Within the smoke and illuminated by the fires, there were knots of people scrambling to and fro, some seemingly trying to get to the gates while others were trying to overrun the former. It was hard to see from here, but there was a center in which he could see figures moving like in a fight. Byleth inhaled faintly. Then she started running again, darting across the field like a dark blue arrow. Dmitri blinked hard, refocusing on the flames in front of him rather than the images interposing themselves on top of the nightmare before him, and rushed after her. They were through the gates moments later, heedless to the fact that their fellow students and allies were still catching up to them. And reaching the heart of the chaos revealed a whole new kind of madness. There were bunches of terrified peasants, young and old, hale or bleeding from terrible wounds, hiding among farm trees or behind damaged houses in hopes of finding tangible cover. The others were men in robes, and other peasants clutching fire axes and kitchen knives. The men in robes were near the middle of the village, throwing blasts of magic against a figure who dodged and blocked, moving from cover to cover due to how outnumbered they was. But it was the peasants that drew his eyes. Their eyes were white, glazed and unfocused. Drool and foam dripped from their mouths, they ran jerkily and without care for where they put their feet. Their clothes caught fire and their feet trampled over burned corpses. They laughed wildly, or gibbered and sputtered kill. Kill, or hurts. Hugh hurts, even as they threw themselves at their neighbors, slashing wildly with their improvised weapons. Byleth ran for the nearest knot of peasants, drawing the creator's sword and lashing out at the nearest med peasant, forcing them back. Dmitri drew his lance, trusting Suthies to guide his professor, and looked to find some place in this madness to start making some headway. His eyes fell on something that seared into his vision. A maddened peasant brought back the axe he had just swung at a small child, whose clothes had caught fire as he attempted to climb into the burning house to escape his tormentor. Dmitri caught a sight of heather brown hair. Just like Miria's. He heard the maddened peasant laugh even above the chaos and screaming. Red bled into his vision. Dmitri didn't really feel himself move, he crossed the distance in an instant, smacking the axe aside with his bare hand when the enemy tried to attack him. The axe flew off to the side, Dmitri grabbed the man's face and surged toward the building, slamming his enemy's skull into the wall. He felt the bone shatter and pulp under his fingers, felt the dying shudders of the body before it went inert. He slammed the remains against its wall 3 more times regardless, leaving an indentation in the brick and stone before letting the body drop. Spinning around, he searched for another enemy within the red. It wasn't hard. Beyond a wall of fire, he saw another maddened peasant running through debris toward a cowering couple. Dmitri let his rage carry him forward, right through the fire and into the peasant, slamming her into the ground. He grabbed the back of her head and slammed her into the ground. "Go to the goddess," some distant voice in his head murmured. Was it his? He couldn't tell. He savagely stomped on the neck, hearing it crack under his heel. Vaguely he heard the frightened peasants try to say something to him. He looked back the way he came, coolly estimating if he could lead them safely out of the front gate. A pair of maddened peasants were blocking off his way. "Come," he ordered them sharply, snatching the knife from the woman he'd killed and throwing it at one of the maddens' back. There was an audible crack, and the man dropped like a stone as sure as a wyvern had landed on his back. "Stay behind me!" Quickly. The words came out as a snarl. They obeyed him quickly. Dmitri surged forward, jumping over the fire again. His fist slammed into the second peasant's skull as he whirled to face him. Again he felt bones crunch and shatter under his fist as the body dropped before him. He didn't stop, or even pause. He had to focus a little attention on not breaking his lance as he moved forward with the peasants at his heels. A man in robes approached. Dmitri rammed his lance through his throat, spinning around before the corpse even hit the ground. He wrenched the lance free and then struck down another man he didn't recognize, not that it mattered. The red blurred everything except the frightened people cowering in the side and the flares of light from Byleth's relic weapon. One of the peasants behind him cried out in alarm. Dmitri spun around and barked duck, before throwing his lance. The weapon went straight through the head of the mage who had appeared behind the 3 innocents he was guiding. "Bastard," the prince sneered even as a maddened peasant grabbed him from behind. He threw his head back, grinning savagely when he felt cartilage shatter while he threw off the enemy's arms. "Come on," he said as he drove his heel into the downed woman's stomach, ignoring the ugly gurgling noise. He threw down 2 more people standing in his way before he reached the gates with them in tow. Just outside those iron doors, he saw his fellow students staring in alarm and horror at the chaos before their eyes suddenly focused on him and his passengers. Dmitri put his hand on the youngest's shoulders and pushed her the rest of the way out of the village. The blood and gore dripping from his fingers stained her hair. He'd have to apologize later. Why are they just standing there? Can't they see what's happening here? Dmitri spun around, distantly aware of his friends trying to speak to him. Having saved those 3, he returned to the fires, desperate to find more. Because no one had come for them. No one had made it in time. Gustav didn't come in time to save Glenn. He couldn't do a thing, could barely walk, his head was spinning so violently. They died burning, died screaming, died without hope, died surrounded by their laughing enemies. The red seemed to grow brighter as he plunged back into the heart of Remire, looking for Byleth. Unsurprisingly, a number of innocent peasants rushed past him, their way to safety cleared by her and her sword. His eyes found a familiar flash of magic straight ahead. Byleth had rushed to aid the person fighting a dozen of those men in black robes. He went to catch up with her when she saw him over her shoulder. "I'll handle this," she screamed back at him before pointing up to the right corner of the village. "There are other people trapped in the flames, please, go find them." "I understand," he yelled back before tearing off the way he had come from before. The hoofbeats of a horse sounded near him, and he saw a flash of red out of the corner of his eyes. Sylvain. Good. He'd be able to move people out faster than Dmitri himself could do on foot. Glancing over his shoulder briefly, he saw Claude, Geralt, and Lysathea running to join Byleth in the heart of the village. Dmitri felt a bloody smile on his face. Making his way past a burning house and making his way into what had been an orchard before it was set ablaze. 2 young people were trying to escape from the burning trees, but were stymied by both a maddened figure and 2 men in black robes. Moments before Dmitri and Sylvain caught up with them, a black-coated figure darted across the field and slammed his sword into one of the mage's back, cutting him down. This distracted the other 2 from their approaching enemies, and Dmitri used the lance he'd recovered to cut down the maddened sword-wielder. Sylvain ran down the mage and pulled on the reins of his horse, leading it in a circle before offering his hand to the 2 trapped peasants. "Hang on," he shouted. "We're here to get you out." Dmitri spun and eyed the black-clad swordsman warily through the red. He made no attempt to approach the 2 trapped peasants after Sylvain started to pull them up upon his horse, instead lowering his sword slightly in a gesture of relief. "Thank you." The voice was low and raspy, hard to hear over the chaos around them. "There are several other people trapped up ahead, there are a couple of obstacles as well as enemies. Please help me." "Who are you?" Dmitri demanded harshly. The stranger let out a dark chuckle. "I wish I could remember," he responded. Even if Dmitri had the presence of mind to try to puzzle that out, he wasn't given the chance before the swordsman turned around. "We need to hurry. Atra is trying to draw most of the men away." Then the man ran up the slope. Dmitri watched Sylvain vanish back toward the entrance only to be quickly replaced with a gravely determined-looking Ingrid astride her Pegasus, shook his head and then followed. "If he's trying to trap me, I'll just kill him on my way to the hostages," he decided. It didn't matter who got in his way. He dashed them into the ground, refusing to let them slow him down. He wouldn't fail, wouldn't be too late, not this time, not for these people. The ground kept shifting under his feet. Dusker flickered in and out of his vision as fires burned and the screaming started to grow less consistent, replaced by laughter and cursing. Bile had formed a rock in his throat, and his heart was pounding painfully. He ignored it, fought to focus, fought to ignore the ringing in his ears, did his best to focus on Ingrid's voice as she called out to him. "There are 10 people trapped up above the ridge. More of those crazed peasants are trying to reach them. That man's getting close, but he can only reach one of the 2 groups on his own. Then we'll take the other," Dmitri bit out when he reached the bottom of the ridge. He climbed it in a few steps, grabbing a fallen sword off the ground as he went. He saw the hooded figure turn to the right about halfway up the ridge, approaching the 2 mages who spun to face him, distracting them from the 3 girls hiding in a bush. Dmitri made his way past him, approaching the top of the slope where an older man was trying to shield a number of children from approaching maddened peasants. Ingrid threw a javelin with precious precision, taking out one of them. Dmitri surged forward and impaled the second one on his lance. He let go of the lance to duck under the wild knife swings of the third peasant before grabbing his wrist and wrenching it out of its socket, yanking the man forward so he fell onto his knees and quickly slammed his knee into the man's skull. Another crack snap shatter, another corpse dropped limply from his hands. There was a rush of wind as Ingrid brought her Pegasus down onto the grass not far from him, throwing another lance at another mage who had been approaching them from behind. Dmitri straightened up, frowning a bit on his hands. They were murky with gore, blood, and chips of bone. Hissing, he shook his hands in an attempt to clean them slightly before retrieving his lance. Then he looked down the hill, and his eyebrows shot up. A pair of maddened peasants had slipped up on the black-clad figure as he was guiding the girls up the slope toward them. Rather than be stopped by this, the man had ducked, blocked a second strike, and demolished both men at the same time despite having to stay in place to defend the peasants. He killed both of them with not inconsiderable finesse, but he was staggered a bit and ended up loosing his hood. Nevertheless, he made his way up the hill to join them. Dmitri choked on clean air. The fallen hood revealed a mess of tangled dark blue hair, tied back in a messy ponytail that was coming loose, strands falling around his face. One of his dark eyes was marred by a burn scar that crossed over it and the bridge of his nose. He was tall, and the young man stared back at him with grim relief mixed with stoic concentration. He knew this face. He'd seen this face in his dreams, in the ghost that followed seemingly his every move. It shouldn't have been a surprise to see him. But Ingrid was next to him. Ingrid clapped both hands over her mouth, a strangled noise coming from the depths of her throat. She stared at the black-clad young man with disbelieving eyes, seemingly forgetting where she was before at last whispering. Glenn. Chapter 32. A hand lightly rested on his shoulder, shaking him. Wake up, young lord. Seath is going to find you if you keep doing this. Claude started awake, blinking rapidly as the low light of the lanterns came back into focus. His back ached from the position he'd gone to sleep in. He winced as he straightened up, rolling his shoulders and wincing as he looked down at the open book that had been his pillow. NGH, note to self, start bringing Linhard along to act as an alibi, he muttered. The words drew a laugh from Tomasz, showing it was indeed the librarian who had woken him. The old man smiled when the brunette finally tilted his head to look up at him, squinting a bit through tired eyes. All the excuses in Fodlan won't help if he finds you with dangerous literature. As endearing as your curiosity is, shouldn't you be focusing on studying? I'm done for the week. Claude complained as he closed the book. It was an old account of a Dresdian capital from before the empire was formed. Why would Seath have the need to remove that from the library? This is a hobby. Ha ha ha. In all my years, I've never heard of a student describing paging through these dusty old tomes as a hobby. Tomasz said with a hearty chuckle. Though if you're truly so inclined, he ruffled through the large bag he was carrying and placed another worn, weathered book on top of the first one. This was written by the same author about the North. Perhaps you'll find it illuminating. Ah. Thanks, Tomasz, you're a lifesaver. Claude snatched the book up and turned through the first few pages. Sure enough, the writing style was the exact same. I thought I'd have to spend another 2 weeks looking for something like this. Tomasz hummed while Claude got up, books under one arm, wincing and muttering to himself as he stretched his cramped muscles. Humor an old man for a moment, my lord, but why are you so interested in times long gone? Claude smirked at him. If we don't know what happened before, nothing will ever change, he said vaguely, grinning. What kind of change do you wish for? The kind that makes enemies, so, thanks for not ratting me out the last 2 times you found me in here. I want to finish up my year of study under Teach before getting on Seath's last nerve. Perhaps it was because he was only half awake or the light reflecting in the old man's eyes was tricking his mind, but Claude swore that Tomasz regarded him with a very calculated look for a long moment. I'm a man of learning, he said serenely. It always warms my heart to see children these days dedicated to seeking more knowledge for the future. Claude, pulling his eyes away from Tomasz standing in front of Remeyer's windmill with a honor guard of black-clad soldiers, told himself that he didn't have time to feel stupid right now. Ignatz, Leone, help Lawrence get them out of here. He yelled with a quick wave before rapidly drawing and fire at a mage trying to sneak up on Atra and Byleth. The forest cover caused him to miss, but the noise alerted his teach, who spun around and threw a fireball at the offending party, setting his robes on fire. Lawrence, 2 children balanced precariously on his horse's saddle, appeared from the row of houses and tore as fast as he dared toward the village entrance. Felix was right behind him, supporting an older man with a bad leg, while a terrified-looking Bernadetta nevertheless guarded them with her arrows. "Got it!" Leonie shouted even as her horse reared back and slammed one iron-shod foot into an enemy archer. Claude couldn't hear it over the fire and chaos all about, but he was pretty sure the impact cracked or outright shattered the guy's skull. The girl pulled on the reins, struggling for a moment to regain control of her horse as the flames and screaming spooked the usually sedate stallion. "Come, big guy, save it for later. We've got work to do." Ignatz ran around and pulled lightly on the reins as well, helping her turn her mount around before rushing to catch up with Lawrence. That as long as Claude could watch them, though, an armored knight immediately zoned in on him. Cursing, he moved backwards, weaving through the bush and rubble to find another vantage point. The man was fairly persistent. But his helmet must have blocked his peripheral vision, because Hilda, mace blazing with green light, shot out from behind a crumbled wall and swung the weapon at his chest. She threw him back into another wall where he went limp. "Thanks," he said quickly even as he strung up another arrow, eyes sweeping the field. He shot down another archer. This one had been taking aim at Geralt, who was tearing rings of retribution through the black-clad men trying to surround them, leaving unconscious maddened peasants in his wake. Suthies helped him, she was, technically, but if she could do more, but it was hard to take out the peasants who had gone crazy without killing them. He was trying his hardest, but the last one had nearly killed him thanks to his holding back. The maddened peasants seemed to either be immune to pain or were so drunk on whatever the fuck had been done to them that they didn't care about it. One kept crawling after him even after he shot out his knee, another one actually pushed her face into the blade of his axe in order to get her hands around his neck. There had been a maddened child who stabbed him in the leg with a kitchen knife. Mercifully he'd been fairly easy to choke unconscious, but the shock had nearly froze him up. It was a nightmare. This was a nightmare. Nothing could compare to the horror show playing out around him. "Annette, can you see Dedu?" Claude yelled when the orange-haired girl caught his eye. He pointed an arrow across the field to where Dedu and Mercedes were backed into a corner, protecting a wounded woman from advancing maddened ones. She nodded frantically. "Go help him. I'll cover you." Somehow he'd stumbled into the role of on-field tactician for both the Blue Lions and Golden Deer classes after they forced their way into the village proper. Byleth was alarmingly quiet except for occasional shouted orders or calls for help. Claude was fairly certain he was on top of the situation. He really bloody well hoped he was, and he needed to stay that way. Keep everyone organized, prepared, and working in teams. Couldn't think about Tomash being here or what that implied. Couldn't look back over the past few months and wonder how he'd been so stupid, how he'd missed it. He didn't have the time. "Ash, what's going on with Dimitri and Ingrid? Why aren't they back yet?" Claude yelled when the silver-haired boy emerged from the far side of the village and scrambled his way, his quiver half empty and a bloody lance in one hand. Blood had splattered his face and hair as well. Once Ash skidded to a halt several feet away from him, he could see mingled shock, horror, and grief in his friend's face. Claude felt a stab of sympathy but knew he had to file it away for later. "Ash." "They're okay," Ash responded shakily. Claude handed him a few arrows before straining to see into the far right corner of the village, past the windmill. He could see some movement beyond the hedges, but he couldn't see Dimitri. And that really fucking worried him because the last time he saw Dimitri there was gore dripping off of his fingers. He couldn't forget the look on the prince's face when he'd all but pushed the first few stragglers out of the village, when they'd finally caught up with him and Teach. He was going to see it in his dreams for a long time. The blonde was completely covered in blood splatters, magnificently indifferent to the bits of flesh between his fingers and the chips of bone stuck under his nails. He'd barely acknowledged them before turning and running back the way he'd came, but not before glaring at them. That look of pure, concentrated rage and hate had shaken Claude to his core. His father would have called it Ash's rage, battle fever, war's cry. When men gave in to the call of war and were consumed by it, knowingly throwing away mercy, wisdom, and love in the name of destroying their enemies for good. A great warrior may well channel Ash's very soul when they succumbed on the battlefield. Could see them, but they were just standing on the hill, Ash fretted, pulling him back to the present. Claude cursed himself for getting distracted even for a moment. They didn't look like they were hurt, but there was someone else standing there with them. It looked like they were talking. Claude nearly said a few words in his first tongue before catching himself. This is not the time, he muttered before saying, send Didu after them once he's freed up, I need Dimitri down here. Ah, okay, got it. Ash said hurriedly before his eyes widened. Ah Claude, there's a villager coming up behind us. The brunette spun on his heels and brought his bow up, taking aim at the drooling, screeching figure. He promptly impaled their shoulder with an arrow. Ash's follow-up hit the thigh, dropping the villager to the ground as they snarled in pain. Letting out a relieved sigh, Claude darted just close enough to kick the improvised weapon. This one had a fence post, off into the bushes before following it up with a kick to the face. Rafe, you got this? He asked when he saw the big guy running his way, another villager slung over one shoulder. No problem, Claude. Raphael said without a trace of his usual cheer. He actually looked angry, which wasn't an expression that Claude had ever seen on his face before. That makes this a day of firsts, doesn't it? He thought rather inanely. Then find Marianne or Mercedes, the brunette said in concern, eyeing the big brawler and noting that his arms and legs had some pretty nasty cuts and bruises on them. Or any of the mages, really, everyone's learned the basic healing spell. Raphael nodded to show he understood before hurrying back to the village entrance where knots of surviving villagers were lingering just outside the danger zone, with Falry tending to injuries and Hannah, Juno, and Justine of Geralt's mercenaries standing guard. Hopefully Falry could spare a moment to clean his classmate up. Claude nodded sharply and jumped over a pile of hot rubble to reach another partially crumbled wall. He saw Ash rushing toward Didu, who tilted his to hear his words while Annette pulled one of the women to her feet. Then he found Byleth again, much to his relief. She still looked all right. She was standing back to back with Atra, watching the field around them for any other maddened villagers who might approach them out of the flames. Bodies littered the ground around them. Claude looked down at the nearest corpse clad in black. His eyes fell on the exposed arm near him, and he could feel his eyebrows shoot upward. The man's skin was so white it was practically the same color as chalk. It was too smooth and wrinkle-free to be the result of overused beauty products or something similar. What the hell? Tamash! Byleth shouted, stepping a foot forward and glaring up toward the windmill. Claude flinched. He could hear grief and anguish beneath the burning rage in her voice, and if he could hear it, he bet Tamash could too. What are you doing here? Over the flames and thinning screams, a chuckle rushed over the battlefield. I am not Tamash, the man said easily, as if he was about to offer her a recommendation from the library. That was merely a disguise that has served its purpose for the mission. Atra snorted. Claude's eyes were drawn back to her as she speared an axe-wielding man in black who had started to recover without even looking at him. The man screamed in agony, couldn't fault him, the brunette thought with a wince as he stared at the brilliant orange flames wreathing the black steel of the blade. Never seen anything like that before. Closest comparison is the Levin sword. How can she use that thing without burning herself? Of course. What's one more murder in the name of a successful mission? She muttered half to herself, keeping half a foot behind Byleth. Claude watched her, both surprised and pleased to see the guarded stance she took on. She was on their side, at least for now. What's going on? Listhei's voice came out in a strangled whisper. The white-haired girl appeared at his elbow, staring wide-eyed up at Tamash. Him? How? The damned librarian. Felix added harshly from behind. He was at the monastery this entire damned time. Bernadetta let out a small whimper of horror. My name is Solon, the savior of all, Tamash declared. Then he was surrounded by a mini hurricane of magic. Claude blinked a few times to focus, watching as their real enemy was revealed. He wasn't a younger man, he was at least as old as he had pretended to be, if not more. But now his skin was as chalk white as the corpses scattered across the ground. He still leaned heavily on a cane, but what he had in his hand was clearly a magic staff of some sort. He wore heavy black robes, and maybe he just couldn't see from this distant angle, but Claude didn't think he wore any emblems or anything of the sort. Just a strange symbol he hadn't seen before. Atra laughed, but it was a harsh and bitter sound. Savior? You're still saying that shit? Fucking hell, that was bitter. That screamed history, and not a good one. You're nothing but another murderer, Solon, that's all you've ever been. Be silent. Solon snarled, storming forward a few steps so he could see his opponents better. His guard moved with him. You're the one who was interfering with my experiment. How could you have counteracted my spells? No beast could have done that, not without help. Wouldn't you like to know? Who are you? Byleth interrupted, taking a threatening step toward the foot of the path up to the windmill. Why did you do this? Solon snorted, turning his attention back to her. Claude could hear the smirk return to his voice as he sneered, to the most noble of ends, Felstar. What the hell is that supposed to mean? I was hiding away in Gareg Mach to get the blood of that little girl called Flane. Did I see her green head bobbling around these parts? How kind of you to bring her close. This man was the one who dash? Fuck. Well, Flane was mostly moving people around with rescue, she should have a guard, deer, or lion. With her blood, we are one step closer to our goal. There was another flash of pink light, to the far right of the village. Bernadetta let out a frightened scream as the Death Knight emerged from the familiar light, leering at them astride his feral-looking horse. I'll have a little fun too, the man rumbled over the fire. Claude cursed as a number of knights appeared on the hill behind him as well. Not too many, it wasn't a proper battalion or anything, but they were tired, battered, and the Death Knight could draw against Byleth. If he got into the village proper, he would kill someone. Claude glanced back at Byleth, grimacing as he drew up a plan that was guaranteed to make her furious with him if it worked and kill him if it didn't. Story of my life. Felix, burn, go and help Byleth. A flash of gold caught the corner of his eye. Dimitri was back in the fight, knocking down a maddened villager with a single backhand. Lysithea, did you master dash? Of course I know how to cast dark spikes, Lysithea snapped, caught somewhere between fear and anger as the Death Knight spurred his horse forward. But I need a clean shot. Right. Either way, this is going to hurt. Stay here and stay down for a second, I'm going to try and give you one. What dash? Distantly Claude thought he might have heard Dimitri shout his name too, but he couldn't be sure. As Byleth, Atra, Felix, and Bernadetta began to fight off Solon's honor guard, he vaulted over the cover he'd been crouching behind and landed hard on the ground. Straightening up, forcing himself to stand light on his feet with an arrow in one hand, Claude stood directly in the path of the Death Knight as the man hurtled towards him. He dodged being trampled, narrowly, it must be said. That stallion was damned fast on uneven ground, and shot at the Death Knight's armored back. It didn't pierce his armor, but it wasn't meant to. Sure enough, laughter rang from within the knight's helmet as he turned around to face Claude as he climbed up onto a broken chunk of the wall. He drew another arrow from his rapidly dwindling quiver. He'd lost his axe some time ago. The horse was heavily armored, unlike many, and amazingly its speed hadn't suffered too much for it. You are not the one I crave, the Death Knight rumbled. Yeah. Claude scoffed and then chuckled. Unfortunately, Byleth has more important things to deal with right now. He was fairly certain he saw the Death Knight's eyes narrow before suddenly he was being rushed. He ducked under the first slash of the scythe. He felt the magic burning the air right above his head, threatening to sear him, and then threw himself forward into the man's side, channeling his crest power into his feet to give him a boost. Pain burst in his ribcage even before he hit the ground, but it worked. He managed to force the Death Knight off his horse. They both crashed to the ground. Now pain exploded between his eyes as his forehead hit the spikes in his armor, slicing the skin and causing his vision to blur. The Death Knight recovered fast, throwing him off and cracking the hilt of his scythe into Claude's shoulder. Not my dominant arm, though, Claude thought over the rush of nausea. He let out a strangled noise as cold armored hand latched onto his throat. It took all his willpower to go limp, to not fight against it as his feral enemy lifted him one-handed up to eye level. Fool, the Death Knight growled, his voice vibrating through his helmet. Claude smirked. Then he rammed the arrow he'd held loosely in one hand right through the holes in the visor, straight into one of the man's eyes. He only got about 2 seconds to appreciate the unholy screech of pain the feral knight before he was dropped to the ground. The impact made his vision blur and go grey as pain racked his whole body. "You will regret this." Lysithea's distorted, distant voice seemed to come from everywhere around him. He shut his eyes as a flare of purple-black light flew over his head, the ground beneath him shook, a horse screamed and then thudded to the ground, and the grating of broken armor. Then there was a blast of energy near him, then nothing. His head was spinning badly. Trying to sit up proved to be a very bad idea. Pain from his side, back and throat seared his mind so badly that he couldn't resist his gag reflex this time. He barely managed to turn his head to the side before throwing up. Some still slid back down his throat, causing him to hack and cough as he fought to clear his throat. Unable to sit up, he tried to figure out how badly he was hurt. Ribs cracked or broken, breathing hurts, throat's probably bruised, shoulders out of joint, forehead wound is still bleeding, yup, not good. Ode. Claude. He coughed again, trying to clear his throat. Moments later he was wrapped in a deep, warm blanket of magic. Relief flooded him as the pain began dimming. He blinked rapidly to clear his eyes of the blood that had dripped into it, hands wrapped around his shoulders and lifted him up slowly. As his vision grew a bit clearer, he saw the glowing symbol of Cethline right above him. The pain was virtually gone as he focused enough to make it out, and even the stiffness quickly followed it. Lysithea was kneeling next to him, eyes wide with worry and slapping his back to help him clear his throat. Flane stood in front, gasping and clapping with relief. The arms around him were stained with blood. Claude rubbed at his face before glancing over his shoulder to see Dimitri, frightened and angry in equal measure, staring at him. "You call that a distraction?" Lysithea shrieked. Claude looked around for a moment and realized that the Death Knight was gone. Gone and not dead, given how there was no body left behind. Well, better than nothing. It worked, he pointed out, so yes. Lysithea's eyes widened and asked in a strained voice, "Flane, can I punch him?" "He should be fine," Flane said in confusion. She let out an adorably startled yelp when Lysithea immediately responded by punching Claude in the shoulder with all the strength she could muster. Which wasn't much, but still dash. "Ow!" he protested. "You moron!" Lysithea raged. The fact that Dimitri hadn't even tried to stop her suggested he actually agreed with her. "I thought you were going to die for a second there." "Don't take the power Suthies gave the professor as an excuse to act like an idiot on the battlefield. You're not allowed to scare us like that, do you hear me?" "Oh my," Flane managed, blinking in shock. "Sorry," Claude offered. He yelped when Dimitri yanked him to his feet and spun him around to face him. The prince tightly gripped his shoulders, his piercing gaze searching him from head to toe. Those blue eyes were so stormy Claude couldn't be certain what he was thinking, except maybe Dimitri was reassuring himself that he truly was all right. Wordlessly, the prince gently stroked his dirty hair away from his face, cleaning vomit with his bloody thumb. "I thought you were dead for a moment," Dimitri said in a quiet rasp. He looked pale and shaken. Claude's lips parted for a moment, shaken and unsure how to react to this, when he saw something over his shoulder, one final maddened villager, armed with a bow. "Mitya, behind us," he warned. He'd dropped his own bow on the way down, he couldn't dash. Dimitri stiffened. In a split second, he let go of his friend and spun around. His posture shifted back into that almost animalistic gait Claude had seen at the village entrance right before he hurtled forward. The brunette instinctively put himself between Lysithea and Flane, but the gesture proved unnecessary. The prince shot forward like an arrow, dodging a shot until he grabbed the villager's head in one hand. Lifting him like he weighed no more than a brick, Dimitri then violently slammed him into a cover wall. Claude flinched at the cracking sound caused by the villager's neck snapped and was mortified when Dimitri, either ignoring it or not noticing, slammed the body against the wall 3 more times before dropping him. "Dimitri," he said, his voice coming out slightly strangled despite the fact his throat was no longer bruised. The prince started. After a moment he glanced over his shoulder, hazy eyes slowly focusing on him as though he had forgotten the other students were there. He started hesitantly, eyes flickering down at his bloody hands. Claude stared back at him, vaguely aware of Lysithea putting a hand on his arm and saying something in a concerned tone. He couldn't quite hear it over the roaring in his ears, his hands felt cold with shock. The offhand manner in which his gentle, sweet friend had just strangled and bludgeoned a man to death without even breaking stride. Dimitri's eyes seemed to clear as Claude stared blankly at him, shame and mortification mingled in his expression, and the prince looked away moments later back toward the battlefield. Giving himself a shake, Claude did the same, looking up toward the windmill. The honor guard was effectively gone, only 2 mages remained, both of whom were being charged by Byleth and the mysterious Atra. Solon had backed up a bit with his wand raised. Claude highly doubted that he was helpless despite his previous persona. Looking around, he quickly found and picked up his bow so he could hurry to join them. As he made his way back to the center of the village, another figure in black came to join them. Claude nearly took a shot at him until he saw a flash of blue hair. Felix must have picked up a coat, wonder why. Dismissing the question for now, Claude looked for Teach again. The blade of the sword of the Creator blazed against the evening sky as Byleth swung it at Solon. The hunchbacked mage raised his staff, the relic sword crashed into what looked like a magical wall. Sparks of multiple colors flew as the blade began to dig into the shield, causing cracks to form across it. Moments later, the blade crashed through, much to Solon's shock, judging by the way he jerked backwards, and clipped the old man's face, causing a nasty cut but otherwise leaving him alive. He wasn't really looking at Byleth, though. His eyes were set on Atra, who was approaching him with both swords partly raised. "You," Solon growled, backing away from Byleth. "Now I know you, now I see you. You're a traitor to our glorious cause." Atra let out a short, barking laugh. "You're goddamned right I am," she said calmly. Solon raised a hand to throw a spell at her. Atra dodged the blast of dark magic, death, unless Claude was mistaken, but before either girl could try to take advantage of this, the man disappeared in a flash of magic not unlike the Death Knight's teleportation. And with that, the battle came to a stop. Claude let out a shaky breath, looking around. Dimitri, Lysithea, and Flane had come to join him. Further back he could see Ash, Annette, and Mercedes looking back and forth. Mercedes pointed into a house that had largely burned out, and the other 2 quickly made their way inside. Lawrence was lifting a swaying figure onto the back of his horse while Ignatz darted back and forth, making sure that whoever it was didn't fall off. Raphael was cradling a small, limp body while Marianne leaned against his shoulder, shaking with grief. Geralt was making his way toward them and Byleth, pausing only to give a quick word and a hand on the shoulder to Sylvain, who was holding the reins of his horse which bore 2 bandaged villagers. A soot-covered Balthus took those reins and patted Sylvain on the back, saying something hopefully encouraging. Hilda was helping Yuri carry someone, dead or alive, he couldn't tell from here while Happy and Constance focused on putting out the remaining fires. The village was in ruins. Houses were partway demolished or burned to the ground, fields were ruined, and everything smelled of ash and burnt corpses. Taking a deep breath and almost immediately regretting it, you never, ever got used to the smell of corpses, Claude began making his way toward Byleth and their mysterious helper. Felix seemed to be of a similar mind, trotting to the foot of the stairs as the 2 girls made their way down. "Are you all right?" the blue-haired boy asked lowly. Claude blinked. "Wait, that's not Felix's voice." "I'm fine," Atra said. All that fierceness that had been in her voice had drained away. "But he escaped. I should have expected he would know rewarp." She stabbed one of her swords into the earth and rubbed her face. "Stupid of me to think only Mycen and Odes made use of that." "Who?" Byleth asked quietly, watching the 2 with unreadable eyes. Before either stranger could answer, a bang startled Claude. He, along with Atra and the Felix look-alike, turned around to see Felix had dropped his sword on the stony ground. He stared in utter disbelief at the young man in front of him, hands slowly starting to shake. Bernadetta was looking back and forth between him and his look-alike, bow hanging by her side, her eyes growing wider by the second. "Impossible," Felix said rigidly, taking a step backwards. "Impossible. It can't be." The blue-haired young man flinched. Dimitri took a shaky breath and stepped forward. Claude opened his mouth to ask what was going on, but was interrupted, again, by Ingrid's Pegasus dropping down to the ground several yards away. The blonde dropped to the ground and ran over, shouting over her shoulder for Sylvain as she made her way to Felix's side. Her eyes were round and full of tears. She came to a stop a few feet away from the stranger. He seemed to shrink away from her, dark blue eyes darting away from her, his whole body radiated uncertainty. "Glenn," Ingrid whispered, reaching out one hand to him. Felix let out a strangled noise in his throat. The blue-haired swordsman said nothing. "Glenn, it's me. It's Ingrid. Don't you recognize me?" Her fingers brushed against his cheek. "I, the swordsman, Glenn." "As in, Felix's dead brother Glenn?" "The one who died in Dusker," managed, staring back at her. That's my name." "You know my name." He looked like he was about to say something else, but Felix let out another noise deep in his throat. It wasn't a growl or snarl or anything Claude associated with the grumpy Blue Lion student. It was soft, keening and weak. The swordsman Glenn started at this, turning toward him. You, Felix stared at him. Oh, he was definitely trembling all over. Bernadetta hesitantly reached over and touched his wrist. Claude glanced at Glenn, taking note of the clear similarities between the shape of their cheeks and the color of their eyes. The spiky blue hair was identical as was the shape of their shoulders. "Either you're a very convincing doppelganger, or... show me." "What?" Glenn asked quietly. It wasn't aggressive or defensive, just hesitant. Ingrid stepped aside, looking back at Felix in concern. Sylvain had run up behind them and skidded to a halt behind his friend, staring open-mouthed at the dark-cloaked figure. Atra, meanwhile, was completely quiet, staying out of the scene and watching it with, was that hope? Bylotha's eyes widened. Claude was pretty sure that she was standing on her toes, as if she needed to do that in order to tower over them. "My brother had the minor crest of Frildarius," Felix responded tightly. The hand that Bernadetta was touching steadied, but the rest of him was trembling so badly Claude was honestly surprised that he was standing still. "If you're really him, show me." The words came out as a snap, somewhere between accusatory and desperate pleading. Instead of balking, Glenn's eyes widened. With no hesitation, he raised his hand palm up and let out a long breath. Pale blue light flashed in the air and slowly formed the elegant symbol of the famed northern crest, lingering for several long seconds before he dismissed it. Felix made that keening sound again. Dmitri let out a choked sound from his throat, while Ingrid's eyes filled with tears and Sylvain whispered, no way, dash." "You bastard," Felix choked out, a tear falling from his eye. "You bastard, where have you been dash?" He pulled free of Bernadetta's hand and launched himself at Glenn. The latter dropped his sword and braced himself as Felix slammed into his chest, grabbing his shoulders with both hands. "You vanished, you were gone, your helmet came back, your sword came back, 4 years, 4 goddess-damned years, why?" Even as he cursed, his grip on his older brother tightened, and he buried his head in the taller boy's shoulder. Ingrid didn't wait for permission, she ran forward and threw herself at Glenn as well, wrapping her arms around both him and Felix. Sylvain was moments behind her, while Dmitri hesitantly trotted forward, tears trickling down his cheeks. He looked torn between joining the hug and keeping his distance. Flame let out a happy gasp and clapped enthusiastically, babbling about the mercy of the goddess. Claude wondered exactly what Suthies was saying to Byleth right now, if anything. Lysithea was watching the scene with an odd smile, while Gerald stood patiently aside even as he stared intently at Atra, clearly wanting to talk to her but unwilling to interrupt. Claude, meanwhile, was keeping an eye on Glenn's expression. The lost Frildarius brother didn't quite look overjoyed at the belated reunion with his loved ones. In fact, he looked about as shaken as Dmitri. He hesitantly rested his hands on the small of Felix's back, returning the hug earnestly but quiet and slightly restrained. He was uncertain, nervous. Why would he feel that way, unless... Wait. He'd looked Felix dead in the eye for a couple of seconds without instantly recognizing his little brother. That was not a good sign. And a close look at his face showed a nasty burn scar over his eye and the bridge of his nose. Considering that Dmitri, and all of Faerghus, believed quite confidently that he was dead. "You didn't get out of Dusker unscathed, did you? Where were you?" Felix demanded in a voice that was shaking with an effort to keep it steady. "Why didn't you come home?" "I didn't remember where home is." Glenn responded in that same raspy tone. Claude winced, because he'd heard that before a number of times. Fires were a frequent mainstay on the battlefield. While his father and Nader knew how to avoid them or keep them at bay, he knew a number of warriors whose throats had been damaged or outright ruined by smoke inhalation. I couldn't remember the faces of my family. I couldn't remember much other than my name and parts of what happened that night. Felix stiffened at the words. Ingrid, meanwhile, let out a soft sob. She already knew or at least suspected. Dmitri shivered. Claude couldn't and didn't resist the urge to curl his fingers around the blonde's wrist. Glenn slowly took a step back, though he didn't let go of Felix nor push his hands away. I should have died, he said quietly. With how much I bled, how many scars I had, I would have died. He shook his head. Atra did what she could. It kept me alive. Atra blinked at that. She glanced over at Dmitri, then at her feet. Then she started to say something, but Glenn cut her off and gave her a meaningful look that Claude couldn't quite interpret. For a moment it looked like Atra wanted to protest, but whatever she saw in his eyes convinced her. But I wasn't. Glenn shook his head a little helplessly, then broke down into a coughing fit. Dmitri reflexively reached for him, but the blue-haired boy shook his head. I clung to life by a thread for a long while, barely able to breathe. And, when I woke up, it was like all my memories had been thrown into the ocean. I keep clawing at it, reaching into the black depths, trying to pull up something, anything. Falry has told me before that incredible pain can cause memories to become blurred. Gerald said eventually, breaking the painful silence that fell in the face of this. Manuela would know better than any of us if she had a look at you, though. Truly. Glenn rasped uncertainly as Felix backed up a bit to stare into his eyes, as if searching for any sign of memory deep within those blue pools. Dimitri's eyes squeezed shut, and Claude could hear the recriminations running through the prince's mind through the rigidness in his arm. He was protecting me, those wounds were taken in my place, it's my fault. I think it's your best bet. Besides, news from the monastery travels fast, it'll be the easiest way to inform your father. So wait. You can't remember anything? Sylvain cut in, aghast. Nothing at all? Everything's blank. Glenn looked pained. His eyes are screaming at Sylvain, don't ask, you don't want to know. Claude decided at that to throw both him and the shaking prince in his hand a bone. Hey, guys. The lions all turned to stare at him. There might still be people trapped in buildings or under rubble. How about you go and look around while you talk? I hate to interrupt, but we're still in the middle of something and the sooner we get the last loose ends taken care of. He let the sentence hang. Both Glenn and Dmitri, however, seemed to grasp the opportunity with both hands. Moments later the five of them set off together along with Bernadetta, headed for the nearest house. Felix wouldn't let go of his brother's arm. With that, well, certainly not settled but set aside for now, Gerald then turned his attention to Atra. Miria said a girl named Atra gave her something that counteracted the pain she was feeling from her illness, he said gruffly. How the hell did a young thing like you come across something like that, and what the hell happened between then and now? Atra's eyes grew a bit cloudy. She turned the fascinating burning blade over in her hand, dispersing the flames, before sheathing it on her left. Solon called you a traitor, Byleth recalled, finally adding her voice to the meeting. Why's that? The mysterious burned girl sighed intensely. Because I left, she said quietly. I abandoned him, his master and their megalomania. I fled their evil when I finally realized how soulless they really were. Not as soon as I should have. Her eyes flashed, empty and broken and grieving and dark when I realized they were planning something here, I had to intervene. I had to she stopped for a moment. I had to try to stop them. Who is he, and what the hell does he want? Why this village? Gerald demanded. Atra closed her eyes. He didn't need a reason to choose this village, she said quietly. He doesn't care who he performs his experiments on. He's an old man with an old grudge who lives in the dark with those he and his fellows have ruled over for ages. And the Death Knight? He works for Solon too? He was the one who kidnapped Flane some time back, Claude said, in an effort to make himself useful in the conversation. The question made Atra snort and shake her head. No. That broken man is on loan. So, he just poisoned everyone here for no reason? Byleth asked. Her voice was soft and fragile. She looked fragile in that moment, her eyes panned over the destroyed village, lingering wherever bodies lay. Muted grief, so much like when she was cradling the chalice in the aftermath of their fight with the beast, was so tangible in her eyes. Claude wondered if he should touch her arm, hug her, do anything to try and support her. Lysithea made that choice for him, at least. She slipped forward and pressed against Byleth's side, lacing her fingers through her teachers. Just because he could. I'm sorry. Atra responded quietly. She met Byleth's eyes steadily. Solon doesn't see any worth in anyone but those who serve him. He wanted to test a weapon of his, I imagine. I hoped that I could counter it quietly, convince him that it was inert, but I was discovered. I'm sorry. Geralt looked at her for a moment, his expression dark and deep in thought. Before he could really respond to that, however. There you are. Claude had almost forgotten the warped, distorted voice they had heard those weeks ago when they rescued Flame. When it sounded behind him, he spun around instinctively, going for his quiver. It was empty, however, and the others joined him in staring at their uninvited guest. The Flame Emperor looked precisely as he remembered him from the underground, same armor, same axe, same icy demeanor in spite of the carnage surrounding him. The figure stood stolidly in place as Atra went rigid and both Geralt and Byleth took up defensive positions, one hand on their weapons. Oh look, Atra said serenely, her lip curving. It's Thales's favorite pet. You're late to the atrocity. Do not call me that, the Flame Emperor snapped. Anger leaked through that synthesized voice. How's he doing that? Magic? If you think I approve of this massacre, you're sorely mistaken. You don't hate it enough not to profit off of it. Atra retorted with a sibilant hiss. The sheer amount of hatred bubbling beneath her voice was kind of awe-inspiring. Spare us the moralizing, only an idiot would believe you. So you're the Flame Emperor, Geralt growled before the armored figure could retort. Indeed I am. I believe you've met my subordinate, the Death Knight. We had a pretty bad first impression, Claude said, before smirking, and adding, I might have broken him a bit. Pity my arrow didn't dig all the way through his eye socket into his brain, but you live and learn, right? He was pretty sure the Emperor was glaring at him beneath the mask. Good. You were merely lucky that your friend was there to save your life. I ought to get you too, Lysithea bit out. The shorter girl was all but vibrating, Byleth holding her back with an arm around her shoulder. To cause something like this. Look around you. Look at the bodies. You did this. You and your med dog and your allies. Do not get the wrong idea. Claude frowned slightly. That tone was almost placating, not as defensive as he expected. It's true that I am working with Solon. But our objectives are not the same. Seriously. Claude said after a moment of silence. Incredulity washed over him. That barely qualifies as hair-splitting. If you're helping him, how are you not adjacent to what he decides to do? It's a necessary evil, one that I have my reservations about. The figure responded. Claude's mind's eye flashed to the dead bodies of a few children that he'd had to step over and barely kept a cold smirk over the outrage that boiled up in his chest. We're supposed to believe something good could come out of this. He bit out sarcastically, gesturing behind him to the bodies scattered across the ground. Freedom is worth it. As is the truth. The Flame Emperor gave him a pointed look. Loathsome as they are, Solon and his like are the only ones who know the truth that has been buried by the Church. I intend to bring it into the light. The Flame Emperor pointedly ignored the strangled laughter from Atra, keeping his eyes on Claude. The brunette's eyes darted momentarily over the mysterious girl. She was doubled over, trying to smother a harsh fit of very dry, very humorless laughter. The truth. He repeated skeptically. Why do you think Solon paid so much attention to you, Regan? The Flame Emperor asked. Why was he slipping you books that the Church disapproved of, considering who you now know that he is? He was trying to feel you out, and I finally think I understand why. He tilted his head a bit. You want to change the world, as I do. Claude snorted to cover up his uncertainty. Well, I would have had to disappoint him, there's a difference between wanting to changing things and being willing to murder children. Those bodies were going to haunt his nightmares. I don't think you're quite a fool. Do you really, truly believe you would be able to change the world without it bleeding first? The figure then turned toward Byleth. You are unique figures, for the power you possess now and will possess in the future. With your help, I could crush Solon, his people, and the chains holding humanity down at once. Join me. Atra straightened up, chuckling mirthlessly. I don't know if you're so arrogant you think that once you get what you want, you can just dispose of them like throwing out a jug of bad wine, or you're so mind-bendingly stupid you think that you can make them your hatchetmen and there won't be any consequences. But then again, I don't really know what to expect from someone who willingly throws his own people into Solon's torture chambers to get what he wants. I refused to be lectured by one of them, the Flame Emperor spat. And yet you're the one performing like a trained dog for them. Atra fired back. Giving them everything they want, while I betrayed and left them. Forget it. Byleth's voice was flat. Claude shivered instinctively. He hadn't heard her speak so emotionlessly since he first met her. I can't forgive you for helping Solon for anything. Not after this. Not unless you walk away from him for good. She drew the sword of the Creator and calmly pointed it directly at the Flame Emperor's mask. If you continue to work side by side with him, after seeing everything he did here, you are my enemy, and I will end you. When she said it, it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a fact. Chapter 33. What should I say, Suthis? The goddess let out a long sigh. Right now? I think there's not much you can say. The reality of this situation being what it is, your steady presence may be the most comfort you can provide at the moment. Isn't that the same as doing nothing, though? Byleth protested half-heartedly, taking care to stand still despite their conversation. Felix was doing enough pacing for the six of them. He stormed from one end of the hall before the medical wing's doors to the other without pause, ignoring Ingrid's occasional pleas for him to stop. Ingrid was leaning against the wall directly in front of the door, fiddling with a gold and diamond-studded ring she'd produced from somewhere. Hindsight suggested that she'd been wearing it under her shirt all along. Sylvain facilitated between joining Felix in his pacing, to trying to pull Dimitri's attention through jokes before tapering off and sitting in uncertain silence. Bernadetta was hovering at the edge of the group, watching Felix with worried eyes even as she fiddled nervously with her sleeves. Byleth was considering sending her shy student off to fetch snacks. The purple-haired archer was clearly worried about Felix. I'm surprised by them. I would have thought that he would have scared her off, but the atmosphere was increasingly wearing on her nerves. It was Dimitri that she was worried about the most, slightly edging out Felix, who at least seemed to have pulled himself together to an extent. Her friend was sitting on a chair with his head in his hands, occasionally shivering and seeming a couple of times to be on the verge of tears. He wasn't reacting to Sylvain's attempts to engage him in conversation. It was as if, despite the fact that he was sitting right there with them, he was thousands of miles away. Byleth was sitting at his side, her hand resting on his shoulder, feeling utterly useless. For the first time she cursed her lacking intuition about emotions. Dimitri was in agony, and she didn't know how to help him. You aren't doing nothing, Suthis said quietly. Simply sitting at his side like this reminds him that he isn't alone. Unless he begins to speak himself, his mind is closed to attempts at comfort. I knew it, he's blaming himself. Byleth tightened her grip slightly on Dimitri's wrist. She felt him twitch, and he raised his head a bit to look at her in turn. His eyes were hazy. Dimitri, how much have you buried ever since that day in Dusker? How much have you buried so deeply that it explodes out of you like it did in Remire? Her eyes dropped down to his hands. His fingers were pale and smooth. There was no sign of the gore that had dripped off his fingers, the bone chips embedded into his palms, the blood staining his skin so thickly you couldn't see his veins. If she closed her eyes and let her mind wander just a bit, she could see him smash Gina's head into a wall without blinking or even pausing for breath. She'd been so maddened she didn't recognize her or Geralt, but the gentle prince she'd grown to care about hadn't restrained her. He simply bashed her to death in a brutal sudden moment. Byleth still remembered that feverish moments of Gina taking her from her father's arms and carrying her up to an empty inn room, telling her father to go and fetch help. Maybe they can't be helped, but... Tentatively, she raised her hand and gently stroked the top of Dimitri's head, trying to mimic the comforting gesture Suthies had used on her before. His eyes widened at the gesture. A moment later, a raw flash of shame flickered through his eyes and he dropped his gaze to his feet again. As if he knew what she was thinking about. "What happened to you back there, Dimitri? It was as if you became a completely different person." Byleth continued to stroke his soft blonde locks, hoping her expression was soft and worried. "I couldn't really focus on it at the time, with the chaos all around us, but you were the one who told me, no matter the reason, it is evil to kill. With all earnestness. That was why I made you uncomfortable at first, wasn't it? I don't believe you were trying to fool me." She saw him slaughter his way through people she'd known with such bloody ferocity and yet worry. The feeling coursed through her veins as she tried to comfort him as they waited for Manuela to allow them to visit Glenn, who she was examining. In spite of what she saw him do, she largely felt worry for him, wondering what caused this inexplicable change in her friend and why it happened. It was enough to dominate her mind in spite of the other things to dwell on. They had brought together the villagers who had survived, carefully bound and tied up the maddened ones who had survived, and brought everyone back to the monastery with a warning letter addressed to both Lady Rhea and Manuela ahead. Once they reached the gate, Atra had slipped away from the group as the Knights of Sirios poured out of the town, murmuring "Come find me in Abyss" as she pulled up her hood and vanished into the crowd. Yuri quickly promised to keep an eye on her. The knights quickly helped them move all the injured and sick to the medical wing, moving Miria out when she protested and looked for her mother. Erin wasn't one of the maddened, but she might still be sick, and Byleth was afraid of contact causing the little girl to relapse. Glenn, meanwhile, was put up in Manuela's personal quarters after Seath confirmed his identity via his crest. In the whirlwind of the past few days, Rhea had made a few things perfectly clear. The church would do everything in its power to heal the poisoned villagers of Remire, but the news of the village attack needed to be suppressed lest it trigger widespread panic, and those who had been maddened needed to be transferred to a smaller, more specialized branches of the central church for extensive treatment. They had left yesterday with an honor guard of knights, meaning Professor Manuela finally had a chance to properly examine a certain amnesiac swordsman. That boy Glenn was quite overwhelmed, Suthies sighed. "I feel for him. Knowing that there is much you have forgotten is vexing, at best. I suppose I should consider myself lucky I am not surrounded by loved ones visibly tormented by my condition." Dimitri was so certain he was dead, Byleth recalled grimly. "He hasn't spoken of that night, but from what little Ingrid has told me about Glenn, I'm willing to bet that Dimitri saw him take injury after injury protecting him, until he was sure." Suthies hummed in agreement, her frown deepening. "I wonder what truly happened that night. Atra has much to explain. Right now, it seems that she's the only one who knows the truth." Byleth nodded minutely, still tugging lightly on Dimitri's hair. She felt him shift under her hand. Blinking, she noticed in relief that the prince was starting to sit up, softening his defeated posture. He still seemed reluctant to meet her eyes, but look at her he did. There was a remorseful apology in his eyes. "Talk to me," she whispered softly, pitching her voice so none of the others would overhear. "Not here. But please talk to me, Mitya." I will," the prince promised, equally quiet and still broken. "You deserve an explanation." "I'm sorry. I just want to understand," Byleth replied. She started to remove her hand, and was startled when Dimitri's slender fingers wrapped gently but firmly around her wrist, keeping her brushing against the side of his head. Rather than blush or stammer as he typically did when acting untoward as he was typically wont to, the prince regarded her shyly out of the corner of his eye and murmured, Please, don't stop. It's comforting." "I see," she whispered back, soft warmth running beneath her skin. Lightly she tangled her fingers in his unruly hair and pushed it away from his face, tucking it behind his ear. "All right then," she did her best to smile at him. She wondered if it looked like Claude or Marianne's real smiles, beautiful and reassuring. It wasn't as though she had very much experience making the expression. It did make Dimitri's expression brighten just a bit. She would consider that a victory. That was when the door opened, cutting the moment short. Manuela looked tired when all 6 students snapped to attention, and for once it had nothing to do with a hangover. The older woman had been working tirelessly on her new patients ever since they had arrived, with only Flane and occasionally Mercedes offering any significant assistance. It showed on her face, which was pale and drawn, yet nevertheless she maintained a healer's temperament, regarding them with gentle calm. "How is he?" Dmitri asked tremulously. Byleth's hand slid down his shoulder and grasped his hand lightly in support. Bernadetta looked like she might want to do the same for Felix, but the latter was too wired to accept any contact. "Physically, he's in remarkably good shape considering what I extrapolated from some of his scars." Manuela let out a breath. "As for mentally, well, the brain is delicate. Fortunately from what I've discerned, he isn't brain damaged at all, but that likely means he has traumatic amnesia. I'm sorry, but while there is a chance he may trigger memories from before that night, it's also entirely possible that he could go for years, if not his whole life, without truly recovering everything." "But he might remember something," Ingrid said a little desperately. "It's possible." Manuela grimaced slightly before quickly making her expression neutral again. "There is precedent for it, but again, I cannot guarantee anything. With that in mind, I'm telling you now, be patient with him. Try not to badger him about trying to remember. Trying and failing to recall his previous life will be very distressing for him." Felix didn't say anything, didn't even acknowledge Bernadetta's hesitant hand on his wrist. His eyes were stormy, there was frustration there, anger, but it was swimming in a sea of regret, confusion, and grief. Byleth suspected that the blue-haired boy had no idea how to feel. Or maybe he was just feeling everything at once. He spent 4 years believing Glenn was dead, all while his amnesiac brother wandered the face of Fodlan with only an enigmatic deserter for company. "Can we see him?" Dmitri asked pleadingly. His voice cracked a bit mid-sentence. Manuela's eyes softened a bit. "One at a time, yes. He's a little overwhelmed right now, but he does want to see you." Dmitri took half a step forward, hesitated, and then looked over at Felix, silently urging him to go first, despite his own desperation to speak to Glenn. The latter's frown softened just a bit before he pulled the door open and hurried inside. Byleth knew it wasn't very polite, but she couldn't help herself. She took a few steps forward, not letting go of Dimitri's hand, and leaned against the frame of the door, mostly concealing herself from view while still being able to see into the room. Glenn was sitting on the edge of his medical bed, staring out the window. He'd been given a standard Blue Lions uniform in place of his dirty travel outfit, the short sleeves revealing a number of scars on both his arms. His hair had been brushed and cleaned, it was longer than Felix's, but just as spiky and unmanageable looking. He sat somewhat stiffly, uncertainty radiating off his posture. Felix stopped a few feet away from his bed. Glenn turned in his direction but didn't get up. From her vantage point, Byleth could see a thoughtful look on his face. "I have 2 brothers," Glenn murmured with absolute certainty. "What?" Felix said, voice rough. "When I woke up, nothing made sense. That night came back in flashes, but all I could really remember is that I was protecting someone. I paid for that with a lot of pain." He said it in a matter-of-fact manner. Byleth still felt Dmitri flinch. "Even when I couldn't see his face, I knew one of you was there." "Felix. Were you?" Glenn trailed off hesitantly. "No. I hadn't been knighted yet. I was left behind with the old Ma, with our father. He'd been left to manage the capital in the king's absence." Felix was standing ramrod straight. "You remember calling the bee, Dmitri, that? Little brother. You always said it as a joke." "I did." Glenn blinked a few times. "I didn't think it a joke then." The then went unspoken. "It didn't need to be explained. You remembered my name." Felix's voice was about as tight as his shoulders. "You didn't at first. After you hugged me, I knew who you had to be. Knowing that Jared, something, I guess. Everything's still a damned murky swamp, but I never forgot that I had a family." Glenn stood up, rubbing his shoulder. "I'm sorry." Felix's fingers dug into his hands. He was shaking again. It was as if he couldn't decide if he wanted to strangle his emotional reaction or embrace it. "Sorry?" "Sorry for what? That you didn't die heroically." Was that a demand or a question? Glenn gave him a bemused look. "No, For vanishing for 4 years when I couldn't find my way home. Atra didn't help you. Glenn shook his head. Atra barely knew anything about the surface world when she pulled me out of that burning field, much less Fairgus. She tried, but neither of us knew where to go or what to look for. I'm very sorry, Felix. If I'd known where home was, I would have gone straight there. He shook his head and gave him a concerned frown. Dmitri, I remember pushing him out of the field. I remember getting stabbed, surrounded. He shook his head. What happened to him? Is he all right? Byleth squeezed Dmitri's wrist. His whole body was racked with a trembling sob. Felix stopped abruptly. Not trusting his own response. He's right out in the hall. Do you want to see him? Please. Byleth glanced at her friend. The blonde's eyes were glimmering with tears. She gently murmured, Are you ready? Why yes, Dmitri said a little shakily. He hesitantly pulled free of her grip and walked into the hospital wing. Ingrid almost immediately took his place at her side. The blonde's shimmering eyes were fixed on the scene, ignoring Manuela's attempts to get her attention. She was still fiddling with the engagement ring around her neck. Sylvain was standing behind them. Byleth wasn't certain what he was feeling aside from worry. His expression had gone glassy. Felix gave Dmitri an unreadable look as he approached for a moment before tearing his eyes away. Glenn. Dmitri, Glenn said quietly, as if testing out the name. You're all right. What dash? The blue-haired young man gave the prince a tiny hint of a smile. It was sad, and tired, but it was warm, more so than anything Byleth had seen from him so far. I didn't know what happened to you for the longest time, Glenn responded quietly. You were with me there, weren't you? I remember pulling you along and sending you ahead. I hoped you were safe when I woke up, but I didn't know. It's good to see you. Byleth wasn't sure what she thought Dmitri wanted to say to Glenn, but apparently that well-intentioned remark, a sign that Glenn, who he thought had died protecting him, had been worrying about him in the midst of all his troubles, had been too much. Dmitri let out a racking sob and seized Glenn in a hug. The way the swordsman flinched suggested there was a bit of the blooded strength in that embrace. Dmitri was crying with little restraint, either ignoring or not caring about Felix's presence right next to him. It was like he was expunging 4 years of grief and recrimination all at once. And just like last night, Glenn started at first, then hesitantly hugged him back. I shouldn't be watching this, Byleth decided, something painful twisting in her chest as she turned away from the sight. I'll find him later. Perhaps you ought to find Ingrid first, Suthies noted solemnly. Glenn said that he remembered he had 2 brothers. Notice the lack of a mention of a fiancé? Byleth swore, pausing mid-step and giving a concerned look over her shoulder at Ingrid. The blonde didn't see it, but Sylvain did. The redhead nodded at her and placed a hand on his old friend's shoulder, signaling that she wouldn't be alone. She hoped she managed a small smile before turning and making her way toward the hall. She hoped that her father or maybe Seath would have some useful advice for her. Yuri had shown her an entrance to abyss hidden in the wall near her dorm room shortly after he joined her class. She'd been both surprised and touched by the gesture of trust at the time. Now she was using it to chase down an errant figure she needed, some answers from. I wonder why Atra wasn't willing to come into the monastery proper like the rest of us. She betrayed Solon and his group, we all saw as much, she wouldn't have been accused of anything. She probably fears potential spies, Suthies pointed out. A perfectly reasonable concern, seeing how long Solon had been strolling through these halls undetected. Abyss offers more anonymity than she would have otherwise. I suppose, but I wonder why she never said as much. Alois was with you. He's a fair man, but she may not know that. Fair enough. The tunnels beneath the monastery were much less foreboding now, with her history within them. It didn't hurt that they were also better lit now, and the people she occasionally ran into when looking for Yuri, she didn't appreciate it when he randomly cut class without a note, "Thank you very much, we're quite friendly now." She was starting to recognize faces as well, if not the names to go with them. Now it felt like an extension of Gareg Mach. Walking over the threshold where she had nearly died still made her wince a bit, though. "Hey, you there. I've got something to report," the guard at the entrance said, waving at her when she walked down the last few steps. "Atra's back, and she seems more pensive than usual. I didn't know that was possible. I thought she only had two emotions, angry and exhausted." "Is that right?" Byleth murmured. "Oh, and your friend Regan showed up a few minutes ago." The guard's brow furrowed. "He keeps staking out the library, reading for hours and hours in the middle of the night. What's up with that?" She felt her lips quirk upward, affection sparking in her chest. "Don't mind him. He's just very curious." She tipped him for his work and made her way down into the square, hearing a confused yelp ring out behind her. The path to the library was a familiar one. The first time Claude failed to make it to class on time this month, she'd checked the room on a hunch and wasn't surprised to find her mischievous friend curled up on a couch with a half-open book on his lap. At least he isn't likely to get caught by the clerical staff here, unlike when he kept falling asleep in the official library, she thought with a mix of fondness and exasperation. Seeing as he'd proceeded to do the exact same thing multiple times in the following week, he clearly was of a similar mind. She heard the low hum of conversation as she approached the surprisingly ornate double doors to the Abyss's library. One of the voices was unmistakably Claude. His tone was indistinct, but it sounded like he was asking questions. The other voice was a soft female one. Byleth was struck by a sudden stab of agitation at that. Who is he talking to? Pushing her way through the doors, Byleth blinked to see Claude sitting at a desk overflowing with books and a lantern sitting slightly precariously on the wide banister. He was pointing at one of the pages, looking up at none other than Atra, who was leaning on both hands on the other side of said desk. Hair untied and falling around her face. She had lovely hair. It was somewhat undercut by how terribly scarred she was, but Atra was pretty in a quiet, understated way if you could look past them. Why was that thought so irritating? Call it dragon's blood? Seriously, why? I don't know, Atra said, shaking her head. That's what everyone I knew always called the crest lineages. It's the same with Felstar. Thales used that title and beast interchangeably when referring to the one who destroyed the Agartha of old. So Thales is the king of Shambhala. He calls himself the High Chancellor, but functionally his role is roughly equivalent. Atra tilted her head to examine the page he'd turned to more closely while Byleth hesitantly made her way over. He pays lip service to having a council, but everyone raised to the high positions is partnered to his vision for Agartha. He has no debates, only discussions. You sound like you'd rather use a different word than discussions, Byleth observed, as much to announce her presence as to raise a question. Atra jolted a bit and straightened up in a hurry, eyes wide as they settled on her. Claude's reaction was more sedate, waving at her to come over. I was worried that you might have slipped away in the confusion. I thought about it, Atra acknowledged. She averted her eyes, looking just past her shoulder or over in a corner so she wasn't looking straight at Byleth. But I've been running for 4 years now. And I know better than to think that I can fight them on my own. Then you'll tell us who they are? Byleth asked. She took another step closer, stopping at the side of the desk. She could feel Suthies pressing gently against the back of her mind, listening attentively and vibrating with anticipation. And what they want. For a moment Atra didn't say anything. A heavy, dark look crossed her face. It intensely reminded her of the expression she saw on Marianne's face when the girl was lost in dark thoughts. Where is Prince Dimitri? Huh? Why would? With Glenn in the hospital, the last time I saw him. I see. Atra turned fully toward her, straightening up. I'll tell you everything I know, I'm afraid it won't be too much. I was a foot soldier, so to speak. A peasant levy. There is much that I wasn't privy to about their future plans, only what I've guessed or put together from what I learned growing up and what I saw as a soldier. She hesitantly glanced at Claude, who was standing up. Regan dash. Hey, I don't mind hearing things twice. It makes me more likely to remember the details. Claude gave her a half smile before adding, I'm just going to get teach a chair. Byleth watched as Atra slowly slumped against the railing, energy draining out of her body. The short sleeves of her shirt revealed more intense tanning, burns, and scars running up her once pale skin. She mostly wore heavily concealing clothes, if that meant. So, how did you end up with so many burns? She asked hesitantly. Atra tugged at her sleeves. I lived my entire life until I was made a levy without ever seeing the light of day. As a consequence, my skin burned very easily for the first 2 years. The rest of it were just consequences of the battles I've fought in, like you. You never saw the sun. Byleth repeated, wondering if she'd actually heard that right. The mental image boggled her mind. It wasn't just her, either. She sensed Suthi's recoil in shock at the casual admission. Wait, how is that possible? It will sound quite mad. Atra warned her. I share my body with the goddess. You'll have to tell me something very ludicrous for me to reject it out of hand. Solan's appearance has opened my mind. I promise. That was when Claude reappeared with a chair under each arm. He put one down behind her and casually guided her down onto it. Byleth felt her cheeks turn flaming red for several moments, lingering even after his touch retreated. After giving Atra a seat, he returned to the desk and sat down, half an eye on the book he'd been examining with her. I was born in Shambhala, the capital of Agartha, and the only one of its great cities to survive the Fellstar's assault. Atra said quietly. Byleth stared blankly back. I've never heard those names. Agartha used to rule all of what is now Fodlan and the lands beyond it, far, far back in ancient times. Thales calls it the Golden Age of humanity. She frowned. Shambhala survived the destruction by activating its ultimate defense mechanism. It was brought deep, deep beneath the earth, buried beneath 1,000,000 tons of rock and dirt. Even that nearly wasn't enough. The city was damaged in the retreat, and it took decades to be restored. Shambhala is deep beneath Fodlan. Byleth wrestled with the thought for a few seconds. If not for Suthi's, she almost certainly would have rolled her eyes at that. How is that possible? By old, venerable knowledge. Atra said. The same things that allow Thales and Solan to build the Titanus and carry out various experiments. Her lip curled at experiments. Either way. The black-haired girl grimaced. I grew up in Shambhala. It was the only world I knew. It was comfortable, but confining. You're not allowed to go to the surface unless you're acting in service of the Chancellor. There is a sunroof, so to speak, that children are allowed to play beneath on state holidays, but the light is very filtered and there's no comparison to the real thing. For a moment she looked nostalgic. Every child made up stories about the surface. We tried to imagine what sunlight felt like on the skin, what it would be like to stand in the waves of the ocean and listen to the wind whistle through the treetops. We imagined it was a paradise. I hope you haven't been too disappointed, Claude joked lightly, having noticed how her knuckles were slowly going a bit white. Atra started. When she recovered, she let out a small laugh, blinking in disbelief as if she couldn't believe it was her making that sound. Byleth was torn between being pleased and that aggravated feeling again. Honestly, no, not really. It wasn't what I expected, but... Her eyes darkened again. Well, Thales and the others painted a very particular picture of the world above Shambhala. Every tale about the surface began with how the Fellstar stole the world from humanity, turning those who served her into mindless puppets who lived only to serve her. He said that she tore out the part of their soul that allowed self-determination, so the surfacers mindlessly obeyed doctrine for centuries, never innovating, never creating anything, never she stopped for a second. I didn't realize Fodlan was split up into 3 separate dominions until I came to the surface for the first time. All the stories only referred to one surface, one group of people so dependent on an inhuman figure they weren't really human anymore. Claude's expression became thunderous, yet he didn't say anything. Somehow that was more unnerving than any rant he might have let loose, which would have been shocking in and of itself. Thales is very particular about how he wants all of us to think. Atra tapped her fingers against the desk. She avoided Claude's gaze, whether of shame or fear. Byleth wasn't certain. His words were all I knew about the world. Listening to him give speeches from the heart of Shambhala was like listening to an all-knowing superhuman. When he paid any attention to one person, it filled you with awe, glee, and reverence. Even though no one could go up to the world and see for themselves if he was telling the truth, no one believed he was lying to us. Everyone. Byleth repeated skeptically. Even in the kingdom, which was famous for the amount of love and loyalty the royal family commanded from their people, had many tales of betrayal and infighting. Unless Thales had cast a literal spell over everyone in Shambhala. You're encouraged to look out for traitors against Agartha. Atra responded, toying gently with a page from her book. Even children are spying on each other, listening for any sign that someone is working against the men who swore that they would bring us back to the surface even if it cost them their lives. And why wouldn't we? What kind of selfish, evil-minded person would betray someone willing to sacrifice anything to set them free from an eternal imprisonment? Neighbors watch neighbors. The city guard monitor all movement between city blocks, no matter how trivial. You're never really alone. And if someone is speaking sedition and treason, there's no trial. It's too dangerous to give such evil a chance to spread. You vanish out of your bed in the middle of the night, and no one ever sees you again. How do you know that, Atra? Claude asked in an altogether too calm voice. Because I saw them come for my mother when I was a child. Atra locked her fingers together, trying to keep them from shaking. I had a nightmare, so I went to her for comfort when we heard the door open. Mother pushed me into the closet and pretended to be asleep, and 5 men burst in, threw a cloak over her head and shoulders and took her away. She shook her head. I don't know what she did. I was never told, even when I entered the military. I never heard any rumors or anything. It was like that cloak erased her from time itself. But you still joined Thales' militia. There was a faint note of incredulity in Byleth's voice as she asked. Her mind spun. He ordered your mother's disappearance. How could anyone willingly make that sort of decision without coercion? I decided she must have done something wrong, because why else would our savior take her away? Atra snorted. I blindly believed what I had been raised on. But now, given what I know, she was probably given to Solon. She choked a bit at that, ducking her head as her shoulders shook violently for a moment. I'm sorry, Byleth said, in absence of anything wiser to say. Solon is Thales' doctor, if you can call the treatments he's perfected medicine. That hate from Remire had come back. The girl's nails dug into her skin. You can hear screaming coming out of his medical wing if you linger near in the late hours. I heard it the last time I dared go back into Shambhala on a fact-finding mission. He's always in the need of new test subjects. He also perfected some manner of spell or conditioning that allows him to control demonic beasts the way one trains horses. Why have attack dogs when you can have something bigger and more dangerous? You've got to be kidding me, Claude muttered, burying his hands for a moment. He snapped up after a second, a flash of alarm in his eyes. Byleth wondered what was worrying him when he said, so Thales says he's going to bring you back to the surface. Why not just raise the city up? Atra smiled humorlessly at him in response. Because the surface world was tainted by the evil Fellstar and become a haven for animals. It has to be purified before Agartha can take back its former glory. The beasts being us, Claude grated. Is that connected to why you called my crest lineage Dragon's Blood? I think so. Dragons are associated with divinity, yes? You mentioned the Immaculate One to me. Solon said that the Fellstar was an evil and selfish god who wanted to stifle humanity's inherent superiority, lest we surpass her. So by claiming that the divine blessing granted to your families was the mere consumption of defiled beast's blood, he dehumanized you further to the children raised in the darkness. That dark, Marianne-esque look grew even stronger. Byleth bit her lip, worried, and asked, what prompted you to finally escape them? Atra shut her eyes. The shame and horror rolling off of her was sickening, a tangible weight in the air around them. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. I was sent out on my first mission, an assassination against a surfacer who worshipped the Fellstar. It was a critical step toward reclaiming the surface, that's what I was told. I was a little uneasy. I'd never killed before, but it would get us closer to a better world, and if it was just some animal-like surfacer, I didn't realize how little I knew. I didn't know anything about anything. Her fingers locked together again. A tear dripped down her cheek, cold and solemn. Byleth suddenly remembered Glenn emphasizing that she had saved his life and the meaningful look she had given him then. She saw Claude's eyes widen moments before Atra spoke the words. When I arrived in Dusker, my job was to poison the wine barrels. So everyone who drank from it would be weak and ripe for the picking. Somehow, it didn't occur to stupid 13-year-old me that we didn't need to poison 24 barrels to kill 2 people until it was too late. The tragedy of Dusker, Claude breathed. I knew it was a setup, but I couldn't find anyone with the means, the strength, and the motive to pull it off. It was Shambhala, destabilizing the kingdom in the name of taking back Fodlan. I was there during the celebration, watching all those people interact without fear or suspicion. I listened to them talking to each other, worried about simple things or reminiscing about previous adventures. Atra bowed her head. She was definitely crying now. I was there when the slaughter started. Bylitha's stomach dropped. Suddenly she was cold all over. Atra's posture hunched in on itself. She shuddered as she tried to speak in a level, quiet voice. I can still hear the screaming. Sometimes when I'm awake I can see the fire and the corpses all over again before my eyes. She swallowed hard. When I was watching the killing unfold, I realized what we had done. What I had done. Is that when you saw Glenn? Claude prodded carefully. Atra nodded shakily. The tears wouldn't stop. Yes. He was leading the prince out by the hand. He was the other official target, you know? Thales claimed we only needed to kill him and his father, but since they don't see the people of the surface as human like us, they slaughtered their way through everyone there just to be sure the two were killed, and create a scapegoat. She shook her head violently. Anyway, Glenn wasn't just leading Dmitri, he protected him from arrows and an obsidian knife with his own body. Atra roughly dried some of her tears, in a futile attempt to stop them altogether. I was frozen. Just sitting there, watching, unable to do anything. Pitiful, I know. But seeing him made me snap out of a bit. I could walk and use my sword. I followed him to the edge of the clearing, where he handed Dmitri off to that other knight and turned to hold the remainder of the men off. He killed so many of them and survived so much, but he was so weak then, he was definitely going to die, and they would keep chasing after Dmitri. So you turned on them. Bylith realized. Despite the enormity of what she had been involved in, she pitied the pathetic, sobbing girl in front of them. She was displaying horror and remorse. You saved him and ensured that Dmitri escaped with his life. Saying the words out loud helped clear the buzzing in her own head, refocus on everything she'd learned. Atra nodded slowly. It's not enough. It's not nearly enough, but she choked, coughing, and hitting her chest to dislodge the lump in her throat. That was 4 years ago, Claude mused. He was unusually calm. There was a storm in his green eyes, but it didn't seem to touch his face. You've been sabotaging them ever since, haven't you? Going on what little you knew, bouncing between sleeping in ditches and crawling around in the dark as you chased after whatever rumor tipped you off. Because you couldn't go straight to Ferdihad and tell them the truth. After all, Thales and Solon couldn't have set up that ambush at Dusker without an ally in the heart of the kingdom. An ally within dash? Shit. It was obvious once Bylith thought about it for a few seconds. Shambhala supposedly had generations to scatter double agents throughout Fodlan. Kingdoms that were in disarray and panic were far easier to topple. It's one of the previous king's royal court. I don't know who, I never saw their face. I was on guard duty when Solon visited them. Atra rubbed at her eyes again. I wasn't important enough to be a witness to a strategy meeting. That still narrows it down a hell of a lot. I've been chasing shadows and theories up until now. Claude leaned back in his seat, looking with that same calming expression. I can't say I'm surprised you ran from Dmitri in Abyss. In your shoes, maybe I would have too. Bylith wondered if he was being honest or just attempting to soothe Atra so she would tell them more. She was fairly certain in that such a position, Claude would own up to it, no matter the position he was in. I wanted to finish this before I gave myself up to him, Atra whispered, wrapping her arms around her chest. I wanted to make sure this could be brought to an end. That's all she sighed. I went to Ferdihad in hopes of finding a relative of Glenn's so I could bring him home. At that time, he was in a coma. Though more pressing matters ultimately derailed my intent. The framing of Dusker? Yes. You tried to stop it, didn't you? For what little that was worth. In the grand scheme of things, I only managed to rescue a handful of people from those flames. The former Agar then breathed out. There's one entrance to Shambhala, but it's too dangerous to try and storm the city right now. Raising an army would leave the capitals vulnerable to the moles. You have to find them first. I guess that makes you the newest member of Geralt's mercenaries. Bylith decided. Atra started violently at this, tear-filled eyes widening. I know it'll be better for you to stay out of sight, but father has a way of making us inconspicuous despite our reputation. If you talk to Yuri, you'll get a better idea of what's going on Fodlan wherever his people are lingering about. She bit her lip hard. Now I wonder how much of what's happened this year is part of Shambhala's grand design. Solon mentioned Flame's blood, and it was when we were saving her that we met the Flame Emperor. Claude snorted. Yeah, he's a character, isn't he? What's his game, if he isn't Agar then? Atra snorted bitterly. Ask him yourself the next time you see him. He'll be happy to share his delusions of conquest with an audience. I see. Thank you for telling us this, Atra. I hope that you'll continue to help us. Byleth said quietly. Atra gave her a strange look from beneath teary eyes. Why are you saying such things to me? Didn't you hear what I admitted to? I'm a monster. I don't deserve any kindness from you. There's no point in hating the sword instead of the man who swings it, Byleth responded with firm certainty. Atra blinked at her, not understanding, but Claude nodded seriously. There was some worry in his eyes, however. Byleth suspected it was for the same reason as her. Suthies, are you okay? You've been so quiet. Byleth returned to the surface through the tunnel near her room, Claude on her heels with the book he'd been reading safely tucked under one arm. He looked deep in thought, which certainly explained how unusually quiet he had been on the way back up. Atra was still in the library, waiting for Yuri to return. Hopefully the purple-haired teen would think of a way they could explain everything she'd told them to the rest of her students. She wasn't used to her ever-snarky font of wisdom lacking an opinion on something. The fell star. Suthies' voice was quiet and troubled. I am greatly sympathizing with that boy Glenn right now, more so than usual. Agartha, Shambhala, the words are needling the back of my mind, but every time I think I've grasped it, it slips away. It makes sense that you of all people would have known about Agartha's existence at some point. The story Atra was told said that it existed a long time ago, Byleth thought. Concern for the childish ghost bubbled up in her. Maybe once we know more, you'll eventually remember something? I certainly hope so. This is driving me to frustration. So, Claude's voice startled her from her internal monologue. He had walked out in front of her, a deadly serious look in his eyes. Part of me wants to tell Dimitri about this right away, but the other part of me is thinking that if I do, he'll go straight to Abyss and smash Atra's skull like an overripe melon. Byleth winced at how bluntly he said it, but she also knew he was right. It will be better if we gently lead him into it, eventually. She said firmly. There's a traitor in the court he's set to inherit, and an unknown enemy in the dark. He has to stay focused on the present, or he might get dashed. She found that she couldn't finish the sentence. Her throat was too tight. Claude shut his eyes and groaned. He's going to be so incredibly pissed off if he finds out we're hiding this from him, even to keep him safe. The brunette crossed his arms. But you're right. Seeing Remire made him fly off the handle. I have no idea what he'll do if he learns about this right now. He trailed off and made an unhappy gesture, looking away to the ground beside him. I don't want to lie to Mitya about this, Claude said unhappily. His father was murdered while he watched. He knew all the knights that died there, even if just in passing. He deserves to know, damn it. You're right, Byleth agreed. Her chest hurt. We'll tell him in time. We need to know what caused that bloody reaction. Outside of the obvious. Claude said semi-sarcastically. He flinched when she snapped a fierce glare at him. Mitya's sensitive, he thinks life is precious. That horrible slaughter, I was holding onto my temper with both hands. Honestly, if I wasn't distracted helping villagers escape, I probably would have done something fucked up myself. Not like that, Byleth rebutted quietly. I've seen you lose your temper, Claude. He winced a bit. He knew what incident she was talking about. Your anger burns cold. It's calculated to cause maximum pain, but even then you delivered a quick death. Dimitri, he was tearing his enemies apart, breaking bones, shattering skulls, no precision, just a blind storm of destruction. She shivered. It was so completely counter to everything I thought I knew about him. Claude let his hands fall to his sides. I knew there was something he was trying to suppress, but this caught me off guard. He confessed. Do you think if we talk to him, we'll get an explanation? I think we have to try. If both of us ask him, he'll open up. I hope. He smiled at her, and did he blush a bit? It was gone too quickly for her to be certain. Either way, together they made their way to the entrance hall and toward the staircase. Reaching the medical wing revealed that it was empty now. Manuela explained that Glenn had left with Felix to write a letter to their father, Ingrid, and Sylvain had left to train, which probably meant Ingrid wanted to destroy a dozen training dummies to vent her emotions and Sylvain was keeping an eye on her, while Dimitri had said that he was going to evening service in the cathedral. Fortunate, in a sense. Returning the way they came, they crossed the bridge over the valley and entered the beautiful cathedral at the beginning of Sitha's service. I didn't realize he held mass as well, Byleth thought curiously as Claude leaned against the wall, pretending to listen intently while his eyes scanned the pews for any sign of their golden prince. I've been here for months but I haven't seen him in his capacity as a bishop before, only an administrator. Sith was speaking at length about compassion and patience, the duties of one to their fellow man. He was an eloquent man, it showed in his candor and the wise way he delivered his speech. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised to see him here. I wonder if Lady Rhea had something come up that prevented her from holding service herself. She is quite busy often. The service lasted about another 20 minutes before ending. Byleth spotted Marianne, Mercedes, Flane, Laurence, and Annette in the crowd of worshippers beginning to disperse before her. She found Dimitri. Claude naturally had seen him first and started leading her toward their friend, expertly weaving through the crowd until they were standing right in front of him. Oh, Professor, Claude. Dimitri looked like he hadn't slept well over the past few days. There were shadows under his eyes and even as he smiled genuinely at them, he couldn't hide it. Did you speak to that woman, Atra? Yeah, learned a lot too. But there's something else that's worrying us. Can we borrow you for a moment? Claude tilted his head meaningfully to the cathedral's side door, which led to a balcony on which they could be assured some privacy. Understanding flickered through Dimitri's sapphire eyes, and his face fell. Of course, he said with a sigh. Shall we? Startled but also relieved by the easy capitulation, Byleth walked at his side as the three of them walked through a pew past the confession box to the tall open doors to the balcony. The cool breeze whipped around her face as they stepped out into the evening. The sunset blazed a beautiful swirl of color across the sky, the distant cry of birds and the rustle of wind in the tree branches was the only sound interrupting the quiet. While there were often people lingering in this balcony in the middle of the day, but later you could count on it to be quiet, remote, and empty. I'm so sorry you saw that side of me in Remire, Dimitri said abruptly, before either of them could get a word in edgewise. The prince looked between them with a tortured expression. I am mortified by my behavior. If I disgust you now, I don't blame you. It's not disgust. Just complete and utter confusion, Claude retorted with the shake of his head. There was a much gentler look on his face than Byleth typically saw in him. Mitya, what happened to you out there? When I saw the chaos and violence there, my mind went completely dark. I lost control. No, I gave up control. I wanted those men to suffer. I felt that too, Byleth said honestly. Claude jerked in surprise and stared at her. I told the Flame Emperor that I couldn't forgive this, and I meant it. If I hadn't been prioritizing saving the people I could reach, then I would have reminded all of you why I am called the Ashen Demon. What would you have thought of me then? I see, Dimitri whispered. His eyes bore dark shadows just like Atra's as he gazed at her, ironic as that was. So that happens to you as well, then? Byleth nodded. This broken look he's wearing, it makes my chest hurt. What is this pain? Am I feeling his suffering like it's mine? My father calls it Ash's rage, Claude said unexpectedly. Dimitri's attention snapped over to him. The legend is that the ghost of the war god is omnipresent at the battlefield. Whenever a skilled warrior catches his eye, he fills them with his rage and turns them into a living gargoyle. An embodiment of war. The brunette smiled wryly. Father thinks it's a bit simpler than that hearing Ash's whispers merely encourages the warrior to let go of their inhibitions. Is that right? Dimitri closed his eyes for a moment before opening them again. I remember telling you once, Professor, that someday we may find ourselves facing something that we simply cannot accept. The chaos in Remire was that for me. You didn't know anyone in that village, did you? Byleth asked. To take their suffering to your heart. It must seem a bit bewildering to the two of you, Dimitri acknowledged, placing a hand on his hip. Quite suddenly his blue eyes darkened and narrowed into slits. He took on a look that was almost dragonic in its fierce rage. Solon and the Flame Emperor are beasts that must be eliminated. Demons who kill the innocent, they don't have the right to call themselves human anymore. Byleth felt her spine prickle in alarm. She was fairly certain she also saw Claude's eyes widen in response. Where is this coming from, Mitya? She asked tentatively, almost hoping he'd take the words back. They sounded so wrong coming from her sweet, heroic prince. It was the flames, Dimitri whispered. Claude tensed up. I've seen that slaughter before, 4 years ago, in Dusker. Mitya, Claude said worriedly, placing a hand on his shoulder. The prince didn't seem to even notice the gesture. His eyes grew faded and unfocused, lost in a moment only he could see. My father, my stepmother, 4 years ago, they lost their lives in those flames. I'll never forget, I still remember their faces. Their screams. The tortured last moments of everyone who died that day, his trembling hands clenched into fists. He gave his head a violent shake. Remembering that, I lost control. I forgot who I was. Claude stared at him, at a loss for words. I didn't want you to see me like that, Dimitri admitted sadly. I didn't want either of you to see this evil part of me. I value your good opinion is very precious to me. The prince's shoulders sagged as he said this. I'm sorry for being dishonest with you. That isn't what worries me, Byleth blurted out, hearing raw emotion racking her voice. Mitya, I'm afraid for you. Dimitri blinked twice at her, and then gave her a wobbly smile. I should have expected nothing less from you. Byleth wasn't quite sure he believed her. But right now all that matters is ensuring that the Remire villagers can go back to their normal lives. He looked between them, smiled sweetly, and bowed to them. Thank you, both of you. For everything. Mitya, Claude said hesitantly. Dimitri straightened up and started to leave the balcony, only to hesitate. There's a reason I came to the officers' academy. Just one. The prince turned around, his expression suddenly melted into that dragonic look again. I came here for revenge. And one day, I will have it. Without another word, he left. Was that supposed to be comforting? Claude wondered, audibly shaken. He looked torn between rushing after Dimitri and staying frozen in shock. What in the blazing flames? We certainly can't tell him about Atra right now. I think we should try not to leave him alone for a while, Byleth swallowed. I'm not sure what else to do. We'll figure something out, Claude said after a moment, still a bit pale, but then his expression steadied and he took on a familiar determined look. I'm not gonna let him fall. Even if I have to hurt him right now, I'm going to make sure he says himself. Chapter 34. Dimitri had to forcibly remind himself not to hover around Glenn all the time. His classes helped a bit in that department, but it was hard not to spend his free time chasing his old friend down and spending every moment he could in his presence. It still felt like a dream, that if he let his surrogate brother out of his sight for long enough, he'd vanish like morning mist and it would all be revealed to be a beautiful, perfect fantasy. Being able to see him, talk to him, felt like keeping his head above water. A small selfish part of him hoped very dearly that the more time they spent together, he'd eventually say or do something to spark Glenn's memory. Manuela's words about traumatic amnesia were constantly on his mind. He knew that he shouldn't push, and he was trying, but it was hard when he mentioned anecdotes from training or childhood and see nothing but confusion or stressed concentration on Glenn's face. It wasn't that his friend was a complete stranger now, that was the worst part of it. When he relaxed, Glenn would drop witty remarks mid-conversation or casually step in to mentor Bernadetta when the latter was struggling with a sword kata. He enjoyed sparring with Felix, Byleth, and Ignatz, indirectly encouraging the latter whenever his lack of self-confidence reared its head. For various small moments it was like he'd never been gone at all. But they were just that, scattered, brief moments. Otherwise he was quiet and withdrawn. He tried to hide it, but the guilt in his eyes whenever he realized he'd missed something, whenever he spoke to Ingrid, was tangible. "Why isn't it enough for you that he's alive?" his stepmother chided him harshly. Dmitri closed his eyes, struggling to focus on Professor Hanneman's lecture on heavy train tactics. He could almost feel his stepmother's presence where she was leaning against his desk. The faint smell of her perfume lingered in the air. "Of course it's enough." She sniffed and didn't respond. Whether she was giving him the silent treatment or accepted his protest, he could never be certain. She often retreated into cold silence when she was angry at him. That had always been her default reaction when she got upset in life. He was less tired than he'd been in a while. The medicine Manuela had prescribed him when she was told about his sleep trouble had given him some welcome relief. His headache mostly abated and in general he felt a bit more put together. "I want you to take this every night for the next 2 months, she had informed him sternly. "Sleep deprivation can kill, young man, and I'm quite miffed that you didn't come to me sooner." "I'm sorry." "I don't want you to be sorry, I want you to mind your health, silly prince." Manuela had lightly flicked his shoulder, a gesture that might have gotten her in trouble had he not been a student. "I'll be keeping an eye on you." Dmitri smiled wryly at the memory. He could hear Claude chuckling at him. Byleth would give him a severe look and keep an eagle eye on him on Manuela's behalf. Imagining their reactions made him smile without even noticing. It seemed he was thinking about them more and more these days. Warmth filled his chest when he thought about stealing time with them. It was a miracle neither had rejected him when they saw the boar. Even Felix hadn't. He shook his head and made himself refocus on the lecture. On another day, the subject would have had his full attention. He loved reading about the battles fought by King Lug, his best friend and tactician, and his queen in the name of forging Faergus. He knew many of them by heart, particularly the original Battle of the Eagle and Lion. Even then he often went back to his books, to pick up details that he'd previously overlooked or theories that came into being in the aftermath. It was hard to grasp the thought that he was descended from almost mythical figure that King Lug had been immortalized as. Occasionally he dreamed of the man, watching in bemusement at how his line had produced such a fragile boy given to monstrous urges. Yet he was indeed distracted now, for all that he'd felt better in the past few days. His mind was on the troubled expressions his two friends had worn when he'd revealed his intentions to them. "What is eating at you, if not what I did?" Dmitri wondered. "Mitya, I'm worried about you," Byleth's voice echoed through his memory. Those wide blue eyes had bored into him, leaving him feeling intensely vulnerable in ways he was unfamiliar with. Licking his lip, he gave his head a slight shake. "Focus," his father scolded him. "Do not waver from your responsibility." Dmitri winced. A cool hand touched his arm, jolting. He turned his head and saw Mercedes brushing her thumb over his wrist while frowning in concern at him. "Dmitri?" she asked sweetly, pitching her voice low so as not to draw attention to them. "Are you all right? You're pale." "Am I?" Dmitri rubbed at his brow, a little sheepish. "I'm all right, I just didn't sleep well yesterday. I've let my mind wander repeatedly already." Mercedes let out a quiet giggle and smiled sympathetically at him. "Oh, that's all right. Everyone's excited for the upcoming ball. You're not the only one who's only half listening to Professor Hanneman right now." She nodded in Annette's direction. Their orange-haired friend was practically vibrating in her seat, tapping her pen rapidly, which Ash was doing his best to ignore, and humming. She finally went ahead and signed up for the Heron Cup competition. Dmitri asked, feeling his mood lift slightly but noticeably. "Yes," Mercedes looked fondly exasperated. "I told her not to be so intimidated by Dorothea, and this morning she made up her mind to go for it. I'm sure she'll do well. I was thinking about perhaps signing up myself." Mercedes tilted her head a bit. "How about you, Dmitri? Have you given any thought to participating?" The prince ducked his head, embarrassed. "I have given plenty of thought to how grateful I am that participation is not mandatory." "You can't dance." Mercedes was clearly muffling another giggle at his expense, the softness of her eyes draining any potential malice from the sound. "I didn't say that. I just can't dance very well," Dmitri sputtered. Sylvain twisted around in his seat in front of them, one eyebrow raised. The prince blushed hotly under the scrutiny and made a mental note to keep his voice as low as possible. particularly under scrutiny. "I'm sure you would do just fine," Mercedes responded, undeterred. "It's not a lot different from the training katas, if you think about it." "I'm sorry, but I fail to see how." He tried to visualize turning dance steps into something more familiar, something he was confident in, but the image refused to form. Mercedes smiled at him. "Hee, I should bring you to talk to Professor Manuela and Dorothea, they were the ones who described it to me that way." She clasped her hands together. "Come now, Dmitri, consider it practice for the ball." Dmitri tried not to groan at the reminder. Yes, he enjoyed occasions such as the one Lady Ria and the church was preparing for them at the end of the month. Yes, he knew that he really ought not to be intimidated by it, seeing as he'd been taught how to dance. But it didn't change the fact that he just wasn't very good at it, and he couldn't help but be a little self-conscious, especially when he had an audience. The ball would be a wonderful time for everyone to relax and enjoy themselves after the chaos and disturbing instances that seemed to be persistently dogging their heels. Now if only he could find a way out of leading the dance. "Our poor professor though," Mercedes said meaningfully. "She told me that she couldn't dance at all. If it weren't for Hilda, I think she would have tried to sit the night out." Silly, isn't it? She of all people should really take this chance to have some fun and relax. "That's true," Dmitri started, only to pause and frown in confusion at Sylvain. The redhead was grinning at him. "Sylvain." "Oh, it's nothing," his old friend responded insincerely. "If the prof doesn't know how to dance, somebody should show her, right? I know a few moves. The goddess knows father shoved dancing lessons on me as soon as I could walk on 2 feet. A hot lance of annoyance tore through Dmitri's chest. "I'm sure Hilda is already helping her," he said, very much though his teeth. "Whoa, no need to make a face like that, your highness. It might freeze that way." Sylvain then had the nerve to wink at him before turning around again. Dmitri glowered and tried to refocus on the lecture. The intrusive image of his careless heartbreaker of a friend dancing with Byleth, his hands on her hips or the small of her back, made a frequent and intense mockery of his best efforts. "Welcome, hopefuls and rookies." Dorothea giggled, bowing dramatically where she stood at the front of the room with Professor Manuela. "Welcome to dance practice. I'm so pleased to see so many of you. The ball is still weeks away, so you might think that you have plenty of time to learn, but beware. Dance is an art that requires energy, patience, and intense concentration." "I'm aware," Dmitri thought not a little fatalistically. He was standing awkwardly near the back of the room, which was surprisingly crowded all things considered. He spotted Ignatz, Leone, and Balthus of all people near the front of the crowd, the former leaning forward anxiously as he hung on Dorothea's every word. Ash was here as well, standing next to Marianne. Yuri was leaning against a pillar on the room across from him, chatting with Claude, hadn't expected to see him here. Claude chuckled at something he said. Dmitri felt a familiar stab of jealousy and wrenched his vision away from the brunette. "You couldn't have him even if he wanted you," he scolded himself. He felt his face burning as longing and frustration warred in his chest. "He's a good man. He deserves better than a half-mad bore." Now longing to find some sort of distraction, Dmitri looked into the crowd again. He saw Petra pulling on Ferdinand's collar and saying something to him that was lost in the babble. Annette was bouncing in place and babbling enthusiastically at Casper of all people. I wouldn't have thought he'd be interested in dancing, while Edelgard was up near the front, listening attentively. Then his gaze fell on Byleth. She was leaning against the pillar on the other side of the entrance, just a couple arms' lengths away from him. Her arms were wrapped around her stomach, and she was tapping her foot against the floor. Dmitri blinked. Usually she stood very still when she teaching, listening to a lecture, or not immediately interacting with someone. She called it a holdover from the time when she had no feelings at all, referred to it as my unique brand of apathy. Even though she wasn't as numb now, it was a familiar position to slip into and provided some comfort. So the fact that she was twitching so visibly. Could she be nervous? The thought was so incongruous. Byleth Eisner, nervous about something? That he almost dismissed it. Then he considered it for a moment, and felt a little guilty about his first impulse. She has emotions, fool. More to the point, she has emotions she is still relatively unfamiliar with. You are nervous right now, How do you imagine she's faring, experiencing a feeling she has little experience with and thus no familiar coping mechanisms for? Dmitri glanced up at Dorothea and Manuela again, where they were standing on the stage. Dorothea was still talking about the basics of ballroom dancing, something he was very familiar with, for all that he often wished he wasn't. Then he walked over to Byleth. She blinked and straightened up a bit as he joined her. "Dmitri?" she asked quietly, tilting her head. One of her hands reached up and tugged on a loose strand of her blue hair. "Claude told me you always do that when you're curious. Called it adorable. I chided him for it even though I agreed with him. Of course I'm pretty sure he knew that, the way he smirked at me. Are you all right, Professor?" Byleth ducked her head a bit, averting her eyes. The gesture was so Marianne-esque, for lack of a better description, that Dmitri was a little taken aback. "I'm fine," she insisted. Yet there was a slight tremor in her voice. "Are you sure?" he asked hesitantly. She seemed to shrink in a bit further. "Oh, of course I'm fine. I just need to learn. Because Hilda said it's impolite to refuse a dance at the ball. For some reason." She buried her face in her hands, muttering, "But who in the blazing flames expects a mercenary to know ballroom dancing dash," in a faint and despairing tone. "She is nervous. I never thought I'd see it." A thought struck him, and he forced down a rueful smile. Of course she wouldn't know how to dance. Even if she'd been to dozens of nobles' balls in previous years, it would have been as a bodyguard, not a participant. For all that lords and merchants alike often rely on them, mercenaries are seen as drudge workers. And if it was never a necessary skill, why would the emotionless Byleth Eisner have bothered to train in it? "Would you believe me if I said I could barely dance myself?" Dmitri asked her lightly. Byleth peeked at him from between her fingers and stray strands of hair. "Huh? But you're a prince. Wouldn't you have to dash? Master at least one commonly used variant." He finished before sighing heavily. "Indeed. However, I have been reliably informed that I was born with 2 left feet." Byleth let out a startled giggle. Dmitri felt the hapless smile crossing his face as she blessed him with the beautiful sound of her voice. "I'm sorry," she said hurriedly when her laughter subsided, "that's just hard to imagine. You walk with such assurance, I can't imagine." "It's true," Dmitri promised. "Ingrid can corroborate for me." Byleth giggled again. "Beautiful," he thought happily. Of course, her expression softened with concern. "How is she dash?" "No, that's a stupid question." She turned slightly and scanned the crowd in search of the blonde girl. "Is she out here?" "So it seems," Dmitri said, unable to quite contain his surprise, when they both saw Ingrid being led up onto the stage by Dorothea. His friend was still dressed in her class uniform, unlike her Black Eagle friend, who was clad in a glamorous red dress from a previous opera. Meanwhile, Manuela was having a piano brought in, carried by Alois and Geralt. Byleth let out a tiny surprised stutter at the sight of him, while looking quite pleased with herself. "Oh," Byleth said with a startled smile. "That's good to see, at least. Perhaps it helps that Glenn isn't here." Although he never really cared for dancing, he only put effort into it because Ingrid was fond of Dmitri. Shuddered the thought before his emotions got the better of him again. "He's probably in the training yard with Felix." Manuela sat in front of the piano, flourishing her wrists. Dmitri noted in a mixture of surprise and alarm that the mass of students in front of them started to find partners. Spreading out across the floor, musical notes began to ring above the low babble filling the air. Byleth's usually stoic face blanched and momentarily took on a look not unlike a deer that had managed to spot a hunter within the trees. Another surge of sympathy solidified his decision. The prince looked away from where Ash was hesitantly sliding an arm around Marianne's waist and Balthus placing his hands on Hilda's petite shoulders to offer Byleth his arm. "Would you do me the honor?" She blinked twice, a light blush coloring her cheeks before she hesitantly placed her hands in his. "Why yes. Though, I think," she let out a small yip as Dmitri guided her away from the pillar and onto the impromptu dance floor, placing his other hand on her hip. "Eep." Dmitri smiled at her. "It's all right, Professor." A smooth, lilting tune flooded the air, the Moon's Waltz, a favorite song of the Alliance. He'd heard it before on the occasional visit in from traveling merchants. He wasn't really familiar with it, but it was a slow and easy-going tune, so it made for good practice. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Dorothea was calling out from the front stage, demonstrating with Ingrid. I'm going to step on your feet, Byleth warned him flatly, nervously glancing in the songstress's direction. I think I'll manage, Dmitri assured her. She glanced at him from under her bangs, nervous and shy. His heart jumped. He tapped her wrist reassuringly. I had to practice with Sylvain when I was young. She blinked rapidly and let out a small giggle. Thanks Uthies, Byleth didn't blink or give any indication her passenger was annoyed by this. Of course, she'd always had a very impassive expression. The song was a relatively slow one. Dorothea was, surprisingly adept as a distant teacher. Perhaps she was recalling her own lessons back at the Mittelfrank Opera Company. Dmitri listened and focused on guiding Byleth through the steps. True to her warning, she did step on and stumble over his feet as soon as they started moving faster than a crawl. She yipped whenever she did this, mumbling apologies and glancing slightly frantically at the front where Dorothea and Ingrid were demonstrating. Her blue eyes were bright and intense, constantly seesawing from the complete concentration she brought to her classes and seminars to something more closely akin to anxiety. Her posture was very rigid, which contributed to her frequent missteps and inability to keep up. Try to relax, Professor, Dmitri urged her, keeping one ear tuned to the beat. Byleth's fingers were digging into his shoulders. She looked past him and down at her feet, biting her lip. Dmitri swallowed slightly at the gesture. I'm not meant for this, I'm not a lady. She ducked her head. That is not true. He'd never looked up at a dance partner before. He was used to being taller than his female companions except for Ingrid. But that was something that accented Byleth's beauty. In his opinion, it was true that she never really carried herself like a woman who knew she was beautiful, but she didn't have to. I'm not a lady, Byleth repeated. She choked on a frustrated, foreign curse word as she stumbled over his feet again at the tempo change. Dmitri tightened his arm around her waist, balancing her effortlessly. I've only ever been a mercenary. Dmitri resisted the urge to frown. I've only ever been a weapon, he heard the words beneath the statement. I haven't often thought of myself as a person before. There had been times, more than he would want to admit, to be honest, after the incident where, in the worst of his emotional spiraling, he'd wished that he couldn't feel anything. That he could cut out all these feelings that were torturing him. Hearing Byleth say that and know that's what she was thinking, his heart ached for her, and wanted to reach back in time to smack his younger self upside the head. To lose his feelings would be to lose everything that made him feel alive. You're both, he said. Living with Ingrid had taught him a few things about how to phrase meaningful compliments so they didn't sound like empty air. You are beautiful, Byleth. Surely Hilda said as much when she dragged you off to get you measured for a dress. Byleth groaned and lowered her head, pressing it against his shoulder. How do you know about that? Right, merci, arg. Actually, I overheard it. Dmitri said sheepishly. She groaned, a hot blush crossing her face. I was at the blacksmith when they brought you into the town. He'd been in and out of that building so much that the man had started giving him discounts in spite of his protests. I've never seen a boy your age break so many weapons, the blacksmith had laughed when handing him the Oresla ear back. You hear all the fables, but mid-story you never think about little annoyances like this, do you? Dmitri caved at that. He blamed Byleth for breaking down his resistance. A prince should pay for his own weapon upkeep, darn it, and had just been leaving when he saw the curious sight of Mercedes, Hilda, and Dorothea clustered around the professor, loudly protesting and babbling about kidnapping the entire way, ushering her over to a pair of bemused-looking seamstress sisters. Hilda had cheerfully waved at the pair, recognizing them from the alliance. We need the best hands available for a tall girl's dress. She doesn't fit any of mine and her idea of formal wear is her school uniform. This is a crisis, you can set a price. Don't tell Claude, Byleth mumbled as Dmitri guided her through a whirl. I've had to bribe Hilda for her silence. He won't hear it from me, he said solemnly while internally squishing an amused smile at the mental image. That song ended, Dmitri gently raised one hand to his partner's shoulder, encouraging her to stop. Byleth blinked and ducked her head so bangs fell in front of her eyes. She always does this when she's embarrassed. I'm sorry, she mumbled. I keep missing the beat. You should probably get a different partner. Come now, I barely noticed. Dmitri responded with a shrug. She blinked at him, her cheeks tinting pink as she looked straight back at him for a moment. Though of course, if you want dash. And no. I dash. Byleth shuffled her feet, tapping her heel a bit. Her face softened. I like this. I just thought, I wondered dash. Her words were partially drowned out by Dorothea cheerfully beginning new instructions for practice. Manuela occasionally chimed in. The words were basically static in Dimitri's ears as he watched Byleth fidget. She was fidgeting. It was so odd to see her behave like that. She was always so composed, perfectly poised, radiating confidence no matter the situation. This other side of her was sweet and strange. It wasn't that she was vulnerable, per se. Was she shy? Testing the waters? Afraid of acknowledging that she felt out of her depth? How could he make her more comfortable? You're doing better than I did in my first lessons, Dmitri said, moving her hand and urging her to put an arm around his neck. She watched him attentively. I'd put them off for as long as possible under the rather childish belief that dancing was solely for women. When I had to learn first, I could hardly take 3 steps without offending my instructor. And she was not impressed with any of my excuses, he recalled more than a little ruefully. Byleth tilted her head, slightly disbelieving. He smiled encouragingly at her. Try to think of it this way, Mercedes compared it to fighting when I expressed my own reservations. Fighting, like a kata. Byleth repeated dubiously. Nevertheless, however, there was a bit of light in her eyes at that. Maybe, she shifted and readjusted her grip on him. Maybe. I'll try to. The piano started up again. Dmitri led her forward, keeping half an eye out to avoid getting too close to any of the other practicing pairs. Byleth's brow tightened with concentration as the slow beat filled the room again. A familiar intensity filled her eyes, a look she took on when she was applying herself to something with the whole of her concentration. He nodded and picked up his pace a bit, encouraging her to keep up and memorize what she was doing. Again, she stumbled and tripped at first. But something seemed to have clicked in her mind, her steps became a bit more confident, and within a scant few moments she seemed to find the rhythm. Frowning in focus, she startled him a little by beginning to hum along with the notes in the air. Her shoulders relaxed fractionally and several moments went by without a misstep. Her eyes were closed in concentration, though, leaving Dmitri to guide them across the floor. That's good, Professor, trusting me to know where you're going? He asked, adding as teasing a note as he could manage at the end. She let out a startled noise and promptly lost her concentration. Oh, sorry. That wasn't meant to be a distraction. No, you're right, she said with a vehement shake of her head. You're being very patient with me, Dmitri. Perhaps I should be calling you Professor right now. I think that would sound altogether too strange. Dmitri tried to picture being called by Byleth's title. The image wouldn't form, even the boys he taught called him Prince. And perhaps more to the point, it was hard to imagine what he had to teach her. Don't call me Professor right now. Byleth half asked, half stated. Her blue eyes were averted when she said it, but when he took in a sharp breath, they swung to meet hers. At the moment, there's too much I don't know to be called that. So, just call me Byleth. His heart twinged. A familiar pain bubbled in his chest, a sense of being pulled in 2 separate directions. The mind and heart going to war. As you wish, Byleth. Her little smile was so bright and warm. The music wasn't just in the air, but in his heart too as he took it in. I'm in trouble, he thought ruefully. I'm in deep trouble. Why is this happening, while Claude also occupies my thoughts? Have I always been this selfish? He shut his eyes, recrimination after recrimination rushing through his mind. I can't treat my 2 dear friends like this, these feelings, I have to let some of them go. I have to. That way I will at least do right by them. Byleth closed her eyes more than once as their practice dance continued. Centering her concentration helped her find the rhythm and she matched each step one at a time, stumbling less and less as the lesson went on. She still stepped on his toes from time to time. It did cause his toes to smart a little, Not that he particularly cared, but as he guided her, being her eyes whenever she was focusing, she was learning. And fast. Remarkable. Byleth's hand shifted, cupping the back of his neck. Oh, goddess. Dmitri resisted the urge to shiver. Or hold her closer, cradle her in his arms. Either were both dangerous and wholly inappropriate right now. Again, Sothis didn't smite him or otherwise express annoyance at being invoked. Clearly the mother was no mercurial figure, he had figured as much when he saw her embrace Marianne, yet still the notion surprised him. It is a little like fighting, Byleth mused as the music beat grew faster. She yelped as she tripped and missed a step, followed by a noise of relief as he straightened her up. I think I can manage this, maybe, her voice trailed into uncertainty. Eep. In a bid to avoid stepping on him, she tripped again and stumbled directly into his arms, forcing him to catch and steady her. Maybe, she corrected herself. Then she scowled a bit, muttering to herself. Dmitri was pretty sure she said something along the lines of, yes, laugh it up, how about I force you to do this instead? It implied something he couldn't quite get his head around and decided to ignore in favor of hastily helping her regain her footing. And forcing down the wonderful feeling holding her in his arms had given him. You're just starting, Pr, Byleth. Saying her name made him shiver. Give it time. It's 2 weeks until the dance, she fretted, seemingly oblivious to his minor panic attack. And I know that I can't do even this much without you, she shook her head. Even if I just have to dance once or twice, to be polite like Hilda said, I want to at least not embarrass myself or my theoretical partner. Well, these classes aren't just a one-off. Dmitri glanced at the stage, watching Dorothea confidently swing Ingrid around and around. She was taking the male part of the dance from what he could tell, a sign of how well-versed she was, he was willing to bet. And a sign she largely lived and preformed in the empire, the kingdom generally frowned upon cross-gender casting. If you have the time for them, you can attend as many as you want. Yuri is helping you with your workload, isn't he? Yes, but my classes, I need time to plan and prepare for them. Can you not ask your father for help? He returned early from his last mission, I'm sure he'd be happy to lend a hand. Byleth bit her lip, visibly thinking hard on it. She frowned slightly. I suppose I could, though. It couldn't hurt. Dmitri smiled at her, letting go of her waist to touch her face. What are you doing, my foolish little prince? Patricia asked mildly. He winced a bit. Byleth frowned in concern at him. You work too much already, my friend. You have friends that are ready and willing to share his burdens. Please, take advantage of it. We're glad to help you every way we can. I've never needed it before. Byleth murmured. A thoughtful, pensive look crossed her face. Or maybe I never felt like I needed it. No one should be alone with their burdens. Especially not a kind person like you, who gives everything she has to others. You keep saying I'm kind, you and the others, Byleth shook her head. Now she looked a little grave, and sad. If you'd met me even a year before you wouldn't believe that. For all my life before I met you I was empty. A demon who felt nothing. I don't care who you were before, the words left his lips without him thinking about them, or even fully realize he was speaking. He just knew he couldn't stand to hear her degrade herself this way. I only know how you've protected me and the others from the very moment we met. You lifted us up, taught us, and cared about us to the point that you were willing to die to save us. What demon would do things like that? Byleth didn't say anything in response. Her eyes were a glimmering and little watery, however, she blinked violently and gave her head another quick shake. Come now, Byleth. Dmitri felt his smile widen a bit. The dance is starting again. Shall we continue where we left off? She nodded, as she repositioned herself. Dmitri's momentarily wandering gaze caught sight of Claude, who'd seemed to have stolen Hilda for a moment. The brunette spotted him in turn, and perhaps it was the distance, but the prince thought that his friend took on a strange expression upon seeing them. Chapter 35. Claude woke with the sunrise. He sat up slowly, stretching like a cat and rolling away the tenseness in his back. The book that had been sitting on his chest fell open on his knees, falling open to a random page. Looking down at the page revealed half of a letter and the elegant, yet somehow malevolent, drawing of a completely unfamiliar crest. Morris's crest, Claude mused as he carefully schemed his fingers over the image. I teased Dimitri for fretting about us being corrupted by our crests, and I don't want him to worry, but perhaps I was being a little premature. I wonder what happened to his little girl after Angel and Michael took her in. I wonder if she lived out her life in what's now Alliance Land. Maybe she and her father were the ancestors of the cursed family, carriers of the crest of the beast. The thought was disquieting, though not quite as much as what he'd read about Maurice himself. He knew he was turning into a demonic beast. Claude thought morbidly. And at some point, he either chose to embrace the transformation, or surrendered to it. Or maybe he didn't choose anything at all, instead just losing any human thought as his body was warped into the twisted creature. He was just a kid, at the start. At least Michael, Ren, and Angel saw him as a kid. Now if only I knew exactly who those there were. Damned water damage and careless curating. He touched the header of the leader, scowling at the ink that had been smudged beyond legibility a long time ago. You'd think the memoirs of the elites would have been treated with greater care. Why was this priceless bit of history collecting dust in some Eastern church basement, of all places? Claude sighed and carefully closed the book before setting it off to the side. The letters mentioned Blutrang a few times, but I can't figure out if Maurice started transforming after he used it for the first time or not. Miquelon didn't transform in stages, and he immediately lost all human reason upon shifting. Maurice experienced a slow rot slipping in and out of awareness. What's the difference? I swear, there's a single, defining difference between what happened to Miquelon and Maurice, but I'm missing a key bit of knowledge. I hate it when that happens. The brunette looked up at the ceiling, lightly knocking his head against the headboard to vent out some of his frustrations. He wondered if there was any chance Atra might know the missing piece. As a matter of fact, he also rather wanted to know where she'd spent her time in between defecting from Agartha and stumbling across them in Remire. But he didn't wonder why she was picking up these old, hidden history books. I didn't know anything about anything. The truth haunted Atra. It was a specter of torment, a choking root of the evil she had lived under and unwittingly participated in. If anyone would be bitterly resistant to hiding history, it would be her. Claude suspected she was always going to wonder, when listening to someone talk about their land or their enemies, whether or not they were hiding something. A strange mixture of emotions bubbled up in his chest when the Agarthan girl flickered through his mind. Complex and difficult to dismiss, since they put him in somewhat of a conundrum. Perhaps it was his father's sensibilities that made it possible, even easy, to pity the ignorant girl used to create a slaughter. To be an opponent in Almira was to be a figure of respect, someone you could drink and joke with if you met them on neutral ground, someone you could later ally with or even marry if the stars aligned. Families didn't carry grudges unless something truly despicable, like the murder of a child, demanded blood for blood. Atra's horror and remorse at the memory of the slaughter, the breach of hospitality, would have softened her sentence even before her age and ignorance of her ruler's true intent were factored in. Claude genuinely believed she hadn't really realized what she'd agreed to do when she poisoned the barrels. And frankly, seeing her shake and tremble as she admitted to her part, he didn't think he could construct a more effective prison than she'd built around herself when she understood what she had done. And therein lay the burning anger. The rage that seared his heart every time he thought about what she had told him. That the surface was tainted and made a haven for beasts. Claude's hands automatically clenched into fists. It was the same old bullshit that he'd been listening to all his goddess-damned life. Other people are evil, primitive, cursed, unworthy of life. Other people aren't worthy of compassion or affection or even acknowledgement of their basic humanity. They should be wiped out before they do us any more harm, threaten our harmony, our place beneath the sun. Pain bloomed in his palm. He bit his lip hard and pressed his fist against the blankets. Deep breaths, little prince, he could hear his mother saying. There are no enemies to defeat right now. Not here. Not yet. Atra wouldn't have agreed to the mission if she hadn't believed what Thales said about the surface. The self-serving lie resulted in so many pointless deaths, and for what? Some notion of human superiority. Well, that was nice for the people who decided what defined a human, didn't it? With a conscious effort, Claude forced the muscles in his fist to relax. Warm blood leaked from the little cuts his fingernails had left in the flat of his hands. Nice going, Khalid, he chided himself as he sat up and fumbled with his desk drawers. It's lucky that you aren't going to practice archery today. The self-recrimination helped drain his anger away. There was no point in getting all worked up when he had no target. He would simply have to stow it away, let it burn until it became cold as autumn frosts, until the moment arrived. The moment he could make certain people's ends as painful and drawn out as possible. You better keep up, Atra, or I might not leave anything for you to step on when I'm done. He briefly entertained saying as much to her face, if only to coax an expression other than exhausted despair or burning anger out of her. Maybe later, once he and Byleth had taken steps to earn her trust. She was skittish as an abused Pegasus foal, not that he blamed her, some ill-colored jokes might turn her away from them. The sooner she felt safe around them, the sooner he could start easing Dmitri into the idea that somebody involved in the greatest tragedy of his life hadn't been a sadistic monster. That she was actually someone at least worthy of pity, if not any level of forgiveness. That was going to take every charismatic bone in his body. He was not looking forward to it. Well, now that I'm too worked up to sleep. Claude sighed quietly and swung his legs over the side of the bed, placing the book carefully underneath more innocuous textbooks in his desk drawer. Sliding it closed with a click, and rather wishing for a lock, like the ones in Sitha's office, he stood up and stretched. Might as well head down and see if I feel like a bit of practice. I'll want to get it done in the morning with the ball coming right up. Rolling his shoulder, Claude got dressed and pulled on his shoes. He was about to get up when he heard a door open further down the hallway. Pausing virtually in place, he listened carefully. The floor creaked ever so slightly, the door closed very quietly. If he wasn't in the habit of listening to anything out of the ordinary, he would have missed it. This person was very good at slipping away. Creeping across his floor, Claude grabbed his door handle and eased it open just enough for him to look out into the hallway, slow and careful so as not to give himself away. Dmitri stood in the hallway, looking up and down the hall. The blonde's hair was a mess, and he was tugging on his coat in an attempt to straighten it out. Surprise and concern mingled in his chest. "You're up early," he remarked, softly teasing as he stepped out of his room. Dmitri spun around and stared for a few seconds before relaxing at the sight of him. "Did the rain wake you?" It had been storming something fierce in the middle of the night. "No," Dmitri said with a slight stumble. "No, I didn't startle you, did I?" "I'm pretty sure I did the startling," Claude teased. Seeing Dmitri tentatively smile in response eased his heart. "Going anywhere in particular?" "I hoped to train a little." The prince looked embarrassed to admit it, probably because it was the day of the ball and he couldn't imagine anyone else wanting to do anything but relax. "That must sound silly, but it helps me relax." Claude chuckled quietly. "Dear Suthies, I need to introduce you to my father sometime." A wave of homesickness crashed over him as he said that, ever since he told Byleth his other name, since he'd had that conversation with Suthies, to be honest, he'd found himself intermittently yearning for his other home. He missed the wide-open plains, he missed the mountains, he missed Ivory, and it wasn't like he hadn't before, but his self-contained focus on his mission helped push those feelings aside. But now that he wasn't alone, now that he had friends, actual friends, how strange was that, the feelings would come at random and fill him with terrible longing. Dmitri blinked, a warmth crept into his ocean blue eyes, bright and almost mischievous. "Tell me about him," the blonde asked, gesturing down the hallway. "I suspect we'd be quite alone at the grounds this morning." The brunette felt his heart backflip and squashed the feeling with some effort. It was hard to ignore these days. "Out of everyone who's ever wanted to hear my life story, that's the funniest reassurance I've ever gotten. Let's go." Dmitri avoided directly meeting his eyes, even as he smiled. Noticing that caused a familiar pain and tightness. "What's wrong? Did I do something? Or is this about what you said in the cathedral?" Claude caught himself before he frowned, and trotted lightly to keep up with his friend. There were a few servants out and about, but apart from them the monastery was quiet. Keeping pace with his prince, Claude kept one eye on his body language. He wasn't showing signs of tiredness as he so often did, but he seemed a little stiff. A change for the better. He waved off a young priestess in training who asked if they were feeling well before they stepped out of the building, trotting in the direction of the training grounds. Once they were soundly out of earshot of anyone untrustworthy, Claude started to talk. He wasn't sure where to start initially, so he picked up where he'd left off in Ivory's story. Father had eventually turned the job over to Nader. He was kind of busy, after all, but he'd taught Claude the first steps in how to fly and how to fight on wyvern back. He'd offhandedly mentioned that taming was a rite of passage, and Dimitri proved very curious about that. While they were inside the hall setting up archery targets, Claude elaborated on the tradition, discussing what was expected of young Almiran children. He was still nervous talking about it, here in Gareg Mach. Frequently he glanced over his shoulders at the closed doors, half expecting to find someone listening in on them and glaring at him with eyes full of blind hate. Yet there never was anyone, and even when he strained to listen for footsteps or whispering, his ears only found Dimitri's curious voice. It was soothing. "You're holding it wrong," he chided Dimitri, walking over and grasping the prince's arm. "This is not a lance. Your muscle memory is tricking you." Dimitri murmured something Claude didn't quite catch, ducking his head in embarrassment. "My shoulder feels strange, so I readjust without noticing. It happens when you have a preferred weapon. There's a reason I barely use axes or swords despite the fact I'm decent with both them." Claude let go of those rough, calloused fingers a few seconds later than he probably should have. He stepped back and suppressed a cough. "No need to draw attention to it. Better." Dimitri smiled at him, something flickering across his eyes. "Thank you." He turned his attention back to the targets, brow furrowing in concentration. Claude hesitantly slung his bow off of his shoulder and strung another arrow. "You're imagining things," he chided himself. He still outshot Dimitri easily. Not really a surprise, seeing as he'd been using a bow since he was 6, but he could tell that his prince found that mildly discouraging. He was hitting one bullseye and then another, though, so Claude just teased him for his Felix-esque training habits. That earned him some sputtered protests, yet nevertheless had the effect that he wanted, pulling him out of his self-deprecation. "He does that a lot, now that I think about it." They continued to practice as the sun slowly crept upward in the sky. Progress was made, small as it was, right up until... "Damn it!" Claude winced sympathetically at Dimitri's pained curse as the string snapped. The blonde was shaking his hand roughly, dropping the training weapon to the ground with an unhappy noise. "Everything all right over there, Mitya?" "I broke another one." He resisted the urge to roll his eyes. "Your hand, Mitya. How's your hand?" "Sheesh, you yelp like someone's poured boiling water on you and you think I'm worried about the bow." He grabbed some cloth off a side table and walked over to his prince. "I'm sorry," Dimitri said after a second. He looked a little sheepish, and there was a red tint to his cheeks. Claude firmly shoved his mind into the box where he kept his silly hopes in. God, how that box rattled and screamed, and took the offending hand in his own, inspecting it. He nodded a bit to himself at the painful-looking but thankfully minimal damage caused by the string snap before starting to bind it up with long practice. Dimitri was very quiet, holding his hand steady as Claude worked. The brunette could feel the prince's eyes lingering on him and avoided meeting them, pretending to be wholly focused on his work. Tying off the bandage, he straightened up, looking past Dimitri and chiding him in a joking tone. "It's really not that strange that I don't want you to get hurt, is it?" "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Just trust me a bit, okay?" Claude did meet his eyes this time, expression serious. Dimitri stared back at him, ocean blue eyes odd and unreadable. His other hand came up and clasped Claude's wrist in his other hand. "I trust you," he said quietly. "Then I can hold you to that, huh?" Claude raised an eyebrow challengingly. He knew when he was being passively deflected. Dimitri didn't answer. He was looking into the brunette's eyes as if searching for something. His eyes softened. Something akin to tenderness crossed his face. Claude's lips parted to ask him what was wrong. He saw something in those gem-like orbs snap and then... It was brief. It only lasted a few seconds. But the kiss was soft, sweet, and inviting. Claude froze at the touch, his mind blanking out as Dimitri's lips pressed against his. Dimitri gasped and pulled away, breaking the kiss. "I'm sorry," he stammered. Then he fled from the hall without a word. "Claude? Are you all right?" Claude jerked up in his seat, blinking several times until his eyes focused on Marianne. The blue-haired girl wore a frown of concern half hidden beneath her long bangs. "What? Oh, yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking." "I thought you were falling asleep," Lysithea said. She fidgeted and winced a bit as Marianne tugged on her hair. "Ow. I'm sorry," she said, ducking her head a bit. "Your hair is so thick, I have to work the tangles out in layers." "I'll try moving a bit closer." Hilda said that wet hair is easier to brush, but I'm afraid of getting your dress damp. Lysithea eyed him warily as Marianne continued to brush and braid her hair, clearly waiting for him to tease her. She looked very uncertain, dolled up as she was in a golden evening dress with emerald bracelets. She clearly wasn't used to dressing like a little lady and was waiting for him to tease her, and he would have, if his mind wasn't somewhere else entirely. He had to forcibly remind himself not to bring his hand to his lips. That would give him dead away. "Need a hand, Mari?" Claude asked lightly instead to redirect the conversation. "Do not let him near my hair," Lysithea blurted out before the blue-haired girl could respond. "Ah, you're hurting my feelings, Lys," he said, dramatically clutching at his chest. She rolled her eyes while Raphael laughed boisterously a couple of chairs over. Somehow the big guy had been wrestled into a two-piece of decently expensive formal wear that wasn't bursting off of his enormous frame, more of Hilda's magic/ability to find miracle seamstresses. "No tricks and no funny business, I promise. It's only an hour until the ball. I'm not that much of a jerk, am I?" Lysithea eyed him mistrustfully for a moment before skeptically asking, "How much do you know about this?" She twitched ever so slightly, wincing when this caused Marianne's brush to pull hard on her scalp again. "Plenty. You can thank my mom later," Claude responded honestly as he got out of his chair and circled around his young friend. "Mother was very keen on making sure I could do my own braids. The meaning behind them is too important." Marianne moved over a bit so he could see what she was doing, and contribute. Right. Carefully running his fingers through Lysithea's long silver locks proved Marianne's observation without a doubt. Her hair was thick and heavy. There was something slightly odd about them, too, like they were a little too soft, somehow. Weird. But he didn't say anything about that. Instead he grabbed a comb and started carefully parting the right side, which Marianne hadn't reached yet. "Pull on me too many times, and I'm gonna stomp on your foot," Lysithea warned him. There wasn't much bite in her words, however, they were underlined with the slightest surprise. "Oh, very intimidating," he teased, feeling ever so slightly more like himself. Claude glanced at Marianne, noting that she was doing up her shorter friend's hair in a half-bun with braids. He carefully combed out a number of tangles before starting to work in earnest, trying to narrow down his view and his mental energy so her white hair was all that he was thinking about. Tried to focus solely on the task, give his spinning mind something to occupy itself on. He wanted to think about anything but the warmth still lingering on his lips. "Dimitri kissed me." His fingers trembled slightly on the comb. He allowed himself a slight shake of the head before forcing his hands to relax. "Dimitri gave me an unquestionably romantic kiss." He started a braid. His fingers slipped far more times than was acceptable for the number of times that he had done this. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't so tired he confused me for someone else. He kissed me because he wanted to. Lysithea let out a little mewl of discomfort that doubled as a warning. He gave her some long-practiced placation that even he knew sounded distracted before moving the braid back and pinning it. Why? When? How? Was he keeping up his smile? He thought so, but he wasn't sure. Marianne glanced at him for a second before returning her attention to their joint work. "Back during that mess with the chalice, Dimitri was acting weird around me and Yuri. He said he was jealous." "Jealous because Yuri kissed me? Is that you, Lysithea? I must say, you look absolutely divine," Lawrence proclaimed after striding through the doorway. He was dressed in expensive formal wear, no doubt picked from the hottest current trend. "I knew it wouldn't take much effort from Marianne to bring out your inner beauty." "You say that to every girl," Lysithea said dryly, but easily. She tugged a bit at her sleeves hesitantly. Claude distantly realized that she had rarely, if ever, thought of herself as beautiful. But it's true. Ignatz blurted out. He, too, was wearing a surprisingly current and very respectable suit. Claude raised one curious eyebrow at Lawrence, who gave Ignatz a pleased nod. As strange as it had seemed at first, Lawrence had taken the short painter under his wing and was regularly encouraging him. Was this by a chance a gift? You look amazing, Lysithea. It really brings out your eyes. He jumped and said. Why you too, Marianne, you're incredible. The absolute truth, Claude heard himself add. He saw Marianne blush out of the corner of his eye. Lysithea shifted a bit, and he half wished he could see her face. Thank you. Claude closed his eyes for a split second, then pinned his next braid. Between the two of them, she was almost ready for the dance floor. Who would steal her away first? Perhaps Cyril, who was staring at her with his mouth slightly hanging open. He was dressed up in clothes very reminiscent of Sitha's. A gift from Rhea, almost certainly. Would Dimitri react like that when He frantically shuddered that thought, with minimal success. I don't get it. I've seen Dimitri looking at Byleth as though she were the goddess incarnate. Which was surprisingly close to the truth, but that was irrelevant right now. He never did anything that implied he might, or, did he? Did he, and I've been missing it? That night he compared me to the fallen star. I thought he was just being oblivious, but what if he wasn't? What other hints might have gone right over my so-called genius? And that led his mind to something inescapable, something massive. Something that was almost too much to contemplate. Dimitri wouldn't make a farce out of having feelings for someone. If he kissed me, it could mean. Claude felt like his brain was getting caught in a watermill's wheel, ground down and crushed, unable to hold on to the thought long enough to fully realize it. His heart was pounding violently as his mind scrambled, clawed at the realization trying to form among so many memories that had insisted it was nothing but a fantasy. There you go, all done, Marianne proclaimed. He blinked twice and nodded, stepping back as Lysithea got to her feet, hesitantly turning around in search of a mirror. Marianne placed a hand on her shoulder and pointed directly across the dressing room to the full-length mirror provided for them. The white-haired girl hesitantly walked over, staring wide-eyed at her reflection. Claude could see the thought in her eyes, who is this stranger and how has she stolen my face, as she slowly turned in a circle, taking in her elegantly tied-up hair, her dress, her jewelry, all that made her look like a completely different and magnificent young lady. It was hard to imagine that this was the same tomboy who was quick to throw books at someone who got on her nerves. See? Told you, Claude teased, clapping his hands together. Lysithea whirled and stared at him, eyes widening slightly when she caught nothing but sincerity in his expression. Where's the professor? Or Hilda, for that matter, Lawrence mused, looking around. Surely neither of them have declined to participate in the ball. Hilda ran off with Teach earlier, Claude responded with a shrug. Claimed Dorothea sent her to ensure the kidnapping was a success. I'm not sure, but I'm willing to bet Mercedes is with them. Apparently they wanted the honor of getting Teach ready for her first social event all to themselves. Lawrence slumped a bit at that while Lysithea snickered. Cyril sighed heavily and mumbled something like, sounds like Hilda, all right. Ignatz sputtered a bit. Oh yeah, I remember seeing Hilda carry the professor off. Raphael said brightly. Actually, she'd gone to get Bernadetta first, she was trying to hide out in her room, YC. Teach was passing by at that point, so Hilda recruited Balthus to carry Bernadetta for her while she got our Teach. She tried to run off, but this time Hilda was faster. I didn't know she could do that. Hilda loves surprising people, Claude said, chuckling at both Lawrence and Cyril's expressions. She has Dorothea to help. She would know a lot about dresses and jewels, Ignatz looked thoughtful. And Bernadetta is friends with her, so if anyone could make her feel comfortable going to the ball, it would be them. Raphael nodded. Yeah, Hilda's got it under control. We can probably go ahead. I guess so, Cyril said, looking like he wasn't quite sure what to think. He looked distinctly uncertain in his fancy get-up, even more so than Lysithea, which made sense, since Almira had pretty fluid ideas of dress for formal occasions, tugging at it constantly. "The dance will begin soon enough," Lawrence acknowledged. "I would loathe to be late for such a wonderful occasion. I suppose I shall just hope that our professor and sweet Bernadetta will not be held up over long by our fellow students and make my entrance. The ladies will be waiting, after all." "In your dreams, maybe," Lysathea retorted immediately, awkwardly picking up her skirts. "Let's go, Marianne, before he tries to trap either of us for a dance." A mischievous look crossed her face. "I'll even help you find Ash." Marianne turned quite red and stammered out protests that went duly ignored by the white-haired girl as she was nudged/lead out of the room. Raphael followed on his heels, saying a bunch of well-meaning things about how Ash would totally pass out when he saw her that were probably not helping his friend's nerves. Claude allowed himself a small chuckle at that before getting up. It helped hide his nerves, hide how his heart was throwing a formal protest at the thought of Dimitri being there, waiting in the dance hall, waiting for him in the light of the setting sun. He panicked when he realized what he'd let slip. He was probably thinking about everything I've been telling myself for a while now. He followed Ignatz and Cyril out, keeping ahead of Lawrence as he turned these thoughts over in his mind. Who knew I could be that oblivious? I haven't felt this stupid well, I don't feel this stupid very often. He quickly revised that sentence to avoid spiraling into recent, unpleasant revelations. There would be a time and a place for them, now he had something more immediate to think about. What should I do? What should either of us do? There's the obvious answer, and the one he'll probably hear from Rodrigue. That it can't go anywhere, because he needs a wife, needs children. There's the answer I would get from my parents: fuck that, bring him home and teach too while you're at it. He resisted the urge to either chuckle or wince at that mental image. I have no idea how receptive Dimitri would be to the idea that my old man's considered a weirdo not just because he married my mom, but because he only married my mom, that he could take another wife or husband but chooses not to. No one has passed the Demon Queen's test in that regard. That would be the tearing point, wouldn't it? He couldn't plan for anything unless he knew what Dimitri wanted. And he had a sneaking suspicion that getting his prince to tell him what he wanted, instead of what his duty demanded, would be akin to pulling teeth. I guess that's the answer for now, isn't it? I need to find out what Dimitri feels, and try to figure out what he really wants. His lip curved upwards. Then I'll bang my brain against the wall that is the holy kingdom of Faergus. Having something of a plan gave him a modicum of peace of mind. He followed his classmates toward the ballroom, which was at the far back of the monastery. The weather was beautiful considering the time of year, but he was glad that the celebration was taking place inside. It just seemed like a wise precaution considering everything that had been going on at this particular location for the last several months. Claude rolled his eyes. Nope, he was not going to worry about that tonight. It was time to take a break, have some fun, eat sweets, and dance. Never even mind that his preferred styles weren't native to Fodlan, it was going to be fun anyway. Ignatz and Cyril worked together to push the double doors open. A warm breeze washed over them via the open windows as they stepped into the crowded hall. He'd gotten so used to his modestly sized class that Claude often forgot that they were only first years in the academy. There were 4 years of study, though going through all of them was optional. The older students had formed a ring around the dance floor, while some of the younger ones were surrounding various tables, trying wine, or snacking on pastries of several varieties. It was beautifully lit by various chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, casting multicolored light through the stained glass windows. The dance floor seemed to glitter with how thoroughly the stone had been tended to. Just as he expected, Edelgard and Dimitri were leading the dance. He must have shown up a few minutes late, because he was supposed to be there with them. Oh well. He just made his way through the crowd, eyes panning it. A sight quickly caught his eye that instantly required him to smother a snicker. Lysathea had somehow spotted Ash near the dance floor and made a beeline for the other boy, dragging Marianne along in her wake. There was a visible parting of the crowd where she'd made her way through them. Now she was hovering at the side, bouncing slightly on her heels as Ash, who cleaned up quite nicely, it had to be said, spoke with Marianne, shy hope radiating off of him. Claude silently bid the both of them good luck and hoped they would have a nice, uninterrupted night. Another sight caught his attention, one that was in the making when he happened to glance their way. Glenn, who looked damned different outside of his battle cloak, he seemed to hold himself completely differently, was awkwardly making his way through the crowd until he came to a stop a few feet away from Ingrid. She was in a lovely white dress and currently stood with her back to him, watching the dance floor. Just as he reached her, the first dance ended as the piano wound down. Whoever was at the instrument only waited a few seconds for the applause as the two royals bowed to their respective partners, two older students that Claude neither recognized nor cared about, before turning his music sheet over. A beautiful slow melody filled the air, and various small couples began to make their way to the dance floor. Glenn watched this with visible hesitation. He swept his long hair over his shoulder with one hand and took a fortifying breath before closing the distance between himself and his former fiancée. He touched her shoulder, she jolted and turned toward him, shock radiating off of her. Glenn shifted from one foot to the other, said something Claude had no hope of hearing, and then tentatively offered her his hand. Though he couldn't see her face, the brunette was willing to bet that Ingrid forced down a tear in response before accepting without reservation, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor. Felix was watching this occur. He was too far away to see the blue-haired swordsman's expression or what he was thinking. Are you happy for them, or do you think they can't possibly work out their feelings for each other over his amnesia? You're even more cynical than I am, so I'm not sure. The other teen was lurking at a table by the window, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. He couldn't have vocalized his indifference to the idea of dancing any louder even if he'd screamed it. Claude mentally wished anyone who hoped to snare him for a moment the best of luck and kept scanning the hall, even as he made his way over to a table and leaned against it. He hoped to avoid the eyes of greedy heiresses. There were only a few people he wanted to dance with, and one of them was currently occupied. Dimitri was carefully leading a disgruntled-looking if well-dressed happy through the slow dance. As his eyes wandered across the floor, he caught sight of Ferdinand spinning a laughing Constance around, giving her the whole of his attention. Everything about his body language sang smitten, clearly there was some history there. Claude then noticed that Linhard of all people, another person who looked startlingly attractive in formal wear, had coaxed Lysathea into a dance-off at the far end of the floor. Dida was also on the floor, guiding Flane around. The green-haired girl was all but beaming, clinging to his arms and laughing. Hopefully both she and her partner were peacefully oblivious to the badly camouflaged Sith who was watching them like a hawk. Yuri was lazily leaning against a table, surrounded by a number of girls and boys who were eagerly chattering at him. He seemed perfectly in his element. Whether he was actually relaxing or ferreting something out, Claude couldn't tell, but he was relaxed and at ease. Hubert was sulking off in a corner, glaring intensely at Edelgard's dance partners. Monica of all people was at his elbow, clearly trying to engage him about something. You'd have better luck skating uphill, lady, Claude thought, scoffing. If he has any interest in anything positive in life, it solely revolves around Edelgard. Petra was curiously eyeing the dance floor while some older student tried to smooth-talk her. Casper was chattering excitedly at Catherine, who was standing by a pillar. Huh, I've never seen her out of her battle gear, wow. I'm surprised she isn't beating off suitors with Thunderbrand. Then again, maybe she does and I've just missed it. There's a sad thought. Lawrence was trying to smooth-talk a thoroughly disinterested-looking female student while Ignatz made his way over to one of the concessions tables. Cyril looked almost terrified of his surroundings, clearly scanning the crowd for a familiar face and trying to stay at the outskirts of the crowd. Eventually he managed to spot Shamir in the crowd, who looked distinctly uncomfortable even in the male suit she'd picked out, and hurried her way. Sylvain was about where he expected to find the redhead, off to the side, surrounded by girls, charming one into taking his hand for a dance. Balthus was in a similar boat, though he seemed to be bragging about previous adventures he'd been in and flexing for their admiration. Yeah. This is a nice night. Claude rolled his shoulder back. He always found formal outfits to be on the confining side. Yeah, you weren't supposed to wear them into battle or anything, but considering how tough dancing could get, you'd think they wouldn't want to restrict your arm or leg movement at all. A number of gasps startled him out of his thoughts. He looked around in confusion, seeing more and more of his fellow students turning back toward the entranceway. They were pointing and murmuring in awe, whispers of "sure that's her," catching his attention. Claude followed their eyes, and saw a sight that made his breath desert him. Bernadetta, his little sister, It surprised him how easy it was to think about the tiny Archer that way, was practically unrecognizable in her dark violet dress. Dorothea had spared no expense to doll up her friend. Violet was an expensive cloth to get a hold of, and the floor-length dress went miles to making her look her age. Often Bernie seemed younger than she was with how frightened everything tended to make her. Now she looked like a young lady, elegant and refined. Her perpetually bushy and spiky hair was smooth as a waterfall and kept away from her eyes with diamond-studded butterfly clips. She was clinging to Dorothea's arm for all that she was worth, shrinking away from the attention their late entrance was giving him. Claude was pretty sure he saw Felix start right off the wall he'd been leaning on when he caught sight of her. As impressive as that was, she wasn't really the one who'd caught his eye. That was Byleth. She was almost unrecognizable, holding hands with an elegant Hilda who was leading her into the room. His teach wasn't walking with confidence at all, her steps were hesitant, fumbling, like she had been transported into a different body. She was completely out of her element, aware of her body in a way she'd never been before. She had always been beautiful, even when wearing men's clothes or covered in grime and sweat from a battle. Now, in a floor-length emerald green ball gown that hugged her curves and muscles, a ruby-studded flower pin in her blue hair, golden bracelets on her wrists and a ruby strung on a necklace around her neck, she was breathtaking. Literally. Claude was pretty sure he went several seconds without taking the slightest inhale, his eyes never leaving her as she slowly made her way in. Mercedes brought up the rear, wearing the smile of a happy older sister as she watched both duos be introduced to the ballroom. Hilda and Dorothea lead their respective projects to opposite sides of the ballroom, beaming at the attention their friends were receiving. Claude wasn't sure he agreed. Byleth seemed to recoil a bit at the attention she was getting. She leaned into Hilda's side, tugging at one of her bracelets. She's never really thought of herself as a woman, she's never been conscious of people looking at her like this, even though people have probably noticed her before. He unhitched himself from the table and quickly began making her way through the crowd. She's so uncomfortable, she doesn't know what to do, I need to get to her. Hilda had the audacity to grin when she saw him push through a gaping pair of older students. He gave her a look that promised future retribution before giving Byleth his full attention. Like she deserved. Her eyes widened slightly as she caught sight of him. "May I?" he asked brightly, stealing her hand from the crook of Hilda's arm. Either feeling cheeky or unusually honest, he kissed the back of her fingers like a proper gentleman. She let out a small involuntary noise as he straightened. A warm blush colored her cheeks as she met his eyes. "I might step on your feet," she said softly, half a warning, half a question. "That sounds like a challenge," he responded with a wink before leading her toward the dance floor. She didn't resist him, not even a little, even though he could feel her uncertainty in how rapid her pulse was. She trusted him. "Tease," she murmured as he put an arm around her waist, tugging her close as they integrated themselves into the dance. Claude smiled stupidly when she rested her head on his shoulder, relaxing as much as she could in his arms. He'd never had a dance partner taller than him before. "You know it," he whispered back. For a second he was afraid he'd gone too far, but then he felt her giggle into his shoulder. That stupid grin came back and he started to lead her around the dance floor. Even though he usually wasn't good at waltzes, his feet seemed to know each step intimately. He swept her across the floor, determined to make this night something out of a storybook for her. True to her word, Byleth did trip and stumble over his feet. He righted her easily, smiling playfully at her vexed expression. He only slowed down enough to let her find her balance, then he tugged her along again, listening to the beat and letting it guide them along the floor. Now, how best to avoid a partner change? As he held her close, as he showed her how to dance, the rest of the world seemed to melt away. There was a brief moment when he was pulled from that warm blanket of bliss, when they swung past Dimitri on the floor. The blonde was almost completely ignoring her new partner in favor of watching them with eyes that read of longing, for which one of them, Claude wasn't certain, and that realization was exciting. "I've never done anything like this," Byleth whispered, not lifting her head from his shoulder. Feeling her breath on his shoulder made him shiver. "You're enjoying yourself," he said confidently. "It's your fault," she replied, the arm around his shoulders tightening a bit. "You make me feel all these things. You've ruined the life I've had up until this point. Wah. How can I go back to it and feel comfortable now that I know you?" Byleth raised her head a bit and met his eyes. You're going to take responsibility for that, right? I suppose it's the only proper thing to do, Claude whispered back. His heart was going to burst at this rate. It's not fair, it's not fair. How do you two do this to me? In what seemed like mere moments later, the song wound to a close. A hand gently tapped on Byleth's arm. Claude turned and found himself face to face with Dimitri. His prince glanced between them, looking a little overwhelmed, before he visibly summoned up his princely training and smiled at them. May I cut in? He asked politely. Byleth made as if to accept, then paused, and glanced at Claude, waiting for his agreement. He winked again and, in what he would claim was another fit of mischief, took her hand and placed it in Dimitri's. Be my guest, he purred, causing both to blush. He wasn't alone for long. Hilda stole him away before he had to start turning down some mercenary third years who'd been eyeing him for a while. You're a brat, he informed her when she wouldn't quit smirking at him. Oh, please. Hilda scoffed, tossing her hair. I did it for both your benefits, like the good friend that I am. What did I do to deserve that? You know exactly what you did, Claude bantered back, rolling his eyes and forcibly warning himself not to blush no matter what. He would never live it down if he did. It was later in the evening that he finally managed to snag Dimitri. He knew that he would have to wait. The prince was a much sought-after partner on the floor, despite not being the most graceful dancer available. So he slipped off to the side after a few dances, got himself a drink and some pastries, and simply bided his time. He was a patient man. His prince was well worth it. Keeping one eye on his prize, he went back to people watching while either avoiding or expertly managing those who came up to him for conversation. Ingrid was sticking close to Glenn. It seemed they were managing to have a good evening despite some obvious uncertainties. Hopefully that would last, but there were bound to be bumps in the future simply as a byproduct of his amnesia. How well Ingrid could manage them would be key to their future relationship. Bernadetta, naturally, had only managed a few dances before fleeing the floor and winding up with Felix in a corner by a table, their mutual lack of sociability a great shield. Ingats at some point had gotten Flane on the dance floor, and after a few rotations brought her over to have some treats. They seemed engrossed in conversation. I wonder what about. Byleth had been swept away by Yuri, who'd finally left Bernadetta and Felix in order to steal a dance with her. Didu and Mercedes were slow dancing together. Cyril, at some point, had either managed to steal Lysathea from Linhard or was picked by her as a dance partner. Dorothea was dancing with Sylvain of all people. How did that happen? Lawrence was trying to chat up Leonie now, and surprisingly she was tolerating it. Edelgard was dancing with Monica of all people. Annette was chatting up Casper, and Ash and Marianne were still together. Catherine had gravitated over to Shamir, and they were surrounded by admirers they were completely ignoring in favor of each other. Ah, there we go. Dimitri parted from his latest admirer. In a fluid movement, Claude wove through the crowd and caught the blonde by the wrist. Might I have this dance? He asked slyly, his tone at odds with the pounding of his heart. Dimitri twisted and stared at him for a moment, his expression like a deer in the gaze of a wyvern. For a moment Claude feared he'd be rejected, or that his prince would flee again, but after a few seconds, Dimitri's expression softened and he nodded. Thank you. Emboldened by his success, Claude took his prince in his arms and led him onto the floor. The closeness let him really feel the electric tension between the two of them as the music started up again. It was as if the whole world had vanished except for those blue eyes. For what seemed like forever, neither spoke a word. Then. Can I ask you about before, Claude? I'm so sor dash. They both stopped, a mutual nervous chuckle rippling through the air. Dimitri tried again after recovering his breath. His voice was low. They both spoke quietly, knowing this shouldn't be overheard. I'm sorry about what happened earlier. That was dash. Claude's chest tightened. Don't say that, he interrupted. Afraid of what he might be about to hear. Why? Why? Don't say you're sorry. Don't say it doesn't matter. You can't dash. He stumbled, stopped, scrambling for words to explain the storm of emotion in his chest. You can't offer me what you did and then take it away. I didn't think you were that cruel. Dimitri's expression crumbled instantly. It wasn't fair, you deserved better. Right now, Claude responded tightly, leaning forward so his prince could feel his breath on his lips. I do not give a good goddamn what I deserve. But I do, Dmitri protested, his voice so soft it was barely a whisper. You deserve so much more than what I can give dash. What do you want? My duty dash. That's not what I'm asking. He wanted to hear it. Needed to hear it. His heart might die if, after being really, truly promised for the first time, this turned out to be a lie. What do you want? Dmitri choked. His prince gave him such a tortured look he almost broke and retracted the question. I want, who I can't have. I want you, the words went unspoken. I want her, he might have added. It wasn't the admission he wanted. Not yet. But it was an admission, one that confirmed almost all of his wild hopes. Claude brushed a quick, feather-light kiss against the edge of his lips, reveled in how Dmitri's breath hitched and stopped. Come with me, he whispered. Check the description for the links to the author.